Hey guys, tonight we begin with the quiet, unsettling tale of the ghosts of the medieval monastery. A place where the air still holds the weight of prayers whispered centuries ago, where candle smoke once curled toward vaulted ceilings, and where even the silence seems to remember. This isn't the kind of haunting that jumps or screams. It's the kind that lingers, soft and patient, in the corners of forgotten stone. A story of solitude, devotion, decay, and echoes that never learned how to fade. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, sharing this quiet little corner of time together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey, one that begins not with terror but with stillness. Let's set the scene. There is a place, tucked deep within the folds of an old European landscape, where the wind has forgotten how to rush and the earth seems to breathe in silence. The valley lies far from any road now used, reached only by thin paths that wind between patches of bramble and crumbling dry stone walls. In the soft dim of early morning, a pale mist drifts across the hollows like a memory that refuses to lift. The air tastes faintly of wet stone and cold iron, the scent that clings to ground that has been untouched for centuries. It is here that the monastery stands, or rather remains. Its bones still hold the shape of sanctity, though time has gnawed at every edge. Walls that once gleamed with lime wash are now a mosaic of lichen and moss, and the carved arches that framed the cloisters have surrendered to ivy's patient embrace. The main tower, half collapsed, leans slightly against the sky, as though bowing under the weight of years. The bell it once held has long fallen, buried now beneath a bed of nettles, its voice stilled forever. The valley itself seems to conspire with silence. The trees, mostly beech and oak, crowd the slopes with an almost reverent stillness. Their roots clutch stones engraved by rain, and their leaves whisper faintly when the air stirs. A stream, sluggish and silver, snakes through the center, where it once served as the monastery's lifeblood. It provided water for the gardens, the refectory, the cloistered fountains where the monks washed their hands before prayer. Now it murmurs faintly through reeds and broken tiles, its sound soft and unhurried, like a lullaby sung to no one. In its prime, this would have been a living valley. A place where footsteps echoed between walls, where bells marked the hours, and where chants in Latin rolled like waves through the chapel aisles. But all that remains now are faint impressions in the soil, furrows where gardens once grew herbs and barley, fragments of old clay tiles, and stone outlines of what had been sleeping quarters, refectories, and scriptoria. Nature has drawn its veil over all of it, blurring the distinction between human endeavor and the endless patience of the earth. Those who have visited this place in modern times, rare hikers, perhaps, or scholars, tracing the footsteps of medieval piety, describe the same sensation. They say the air feels heavier here, though not oppressive, more like it remembers. The ground underfoot is soft with centuries of fallen leaves, and yet every stone one touches feels cold, as if holding within it the memory of prayers once whispered nearby. The architecture tells stories to those who know how to read it. Romanesque foundations still press upward from beneath Gothic additions, revealing the long span of centuries that passed between its founding and its abandonment. The rough-cut sandstone of the earliest construction still bears the chisel marks of local masons, men whose names were never written down, but whose work endures more faithfully than the manuscripts they copied. The monastery's layout follows the Benedictine plan common in the 12th and 13th centuries, the church at the center, cloisters running alongside, and the refectory and dormitory forming the body of the structure. The entire design was meant to imitate a living organism, each corridor and courtyard serving as artery and vein, feeding devotion toward a heart of silence. Scholars have debated its precise origins. Some claim it was founded by a small community of Benedictine brothers seeking solitude after the reforms of Cluny spread across Europe. Others suggest it might have been Cistercian, given its isolation and the austerity of its architecture. Both orders favored valleys like this, hidden places near rivers or springs, where stone could be quarried nearby, and where isolation offered purity. In those times, remoteness was not a burden but a virtue. The valley's remoteness, however, became its undoing. When trade routes shifted and villages grew around newer roads, this place was left behind, its connection to the world slowly thinning until it vanished altogether. Over the centuries, storms took their toll, roofs collapsed, and the surrounding forest crept closer each year. What the monks had once called God's silence became the silence of absence. Sometimes in the late evening, when the sun begins to fade behind the hills, the stones seem to take on a faint glow. It is not light in the normal sense, more like a subtle shimmer, the way certain ancient buildings hold warmth from the day long after the sun has gone. Travelers in earlier centuries wrote of this phenomenon in their journals. They claimed that the stones of old monasteries keep the ghost of light, as if unwilling to let go of the last prayer spoken within their walls. One might imagine the monks walking here once, their sandals soft against the earth, their hoods drawn low, their routines carved time into quiet shapes. Dawn prayers, silent meals, the scratch of quills against parchment, the slow turning of seasons marked only by the scent of different herbs blooming in the garden. Everything that ever lived here moved according to rhythm and patience, a cadence that modern life has forgotten. Even now, the echoes of that rhythm remain. The valley hums faintly in the stillness, not with sound but with the weight of endurance. Each stone is a small monument to the persistence of purpose, the idea that silence, once consecrated, never truly ceases. When the wind drifts through the broken cloister arches, it carries with it faint tones, like a half-remembered chant, though it may only be the sound of air moving through hollow stone. Birds nest in the choir stalls, and small animals make homes where once books were kept. Time has not destroyed the monastery. It has simply absorbed it, the way the ocean folds shipwrecks into coral reefs. Some say places like this are haunted. Others say they are merely too quiet for modern ears. But perhaps both ideas are the same. A haunting need not be a ghostly figure or a sudden sound. It can be the simple persistence of memory, a breath that refuses to vanish, a prayer still echoing in an empty valley of stone. And as night gathers here, the mist thickens once more. The last light fades from the hills, leaving only the dim shimmer of the stream winding toward the horizon. The monastery stands unchanged, its shadow cast long and still, as if the centuries themselves pause before entering. The story of how it came to be, who built it, what faith moved them, and why they chose this silent valley, belongs to another time. A time when men sought God, not in cities but in the hidden corners of the earth, where only wind and water could bear witness to their devotion. The story of the monastery begins long before its walls were swallowed by ivy, and its stones turned cold beneath the passing centuries. In the early years of the 12th century, when Europe still trembled from the aftershocks of wars and crusades, faith was the one enduring architecture of the age. Across the continent, men and women turned to God not for comfort alone but for structure, something stable in a world that was always shifting. It was in this spirit that a small brotherhood of monks sought a place apart from the noise of the kingdoms and the clamour of men, a place where prayer could live unbroken by politics or pride. The valley they chose had no name then, merely a hollow between hills, thick with forest and fog. Local villagers rarely entered it, believing it to be too remote, too damp and too full of strange lights after dark. But to the monks who found it, the valley was perfect. They were men of the Benedictine order, drawn by the rule of Saint Benedict of Nursia, ora et labora, pray and work. It was a life meant to be simple, balanced and free from worldly ambition. The order had already spread across Europe since the 6th century, but by the 12th new reforms were stirring among those who sought to restore the purity of early monasticism. The valley would become their experiment in silence. The founding abbot, whose name appears in only one surviving charter, Abbas Petrus de Vallis Silente, was a man of middle age, likely educated at Cluny or one of its daughter houses in France. He had grown weary of the wealth and ornament that had crept into monastic life in the great abbeys. Pilgrims and nobles brought donations, kings offered lands, and slowly the ideal of simplicity was drowned beneath gold. So he and a dozen companions set out to build something humbler. They crossed into a sparsely inhabited region of the northern hills, far from royal roads and market towns, where land could be claimed for little more than the promise of cultivation and prayer. Their first structure was nothing more than a wooden oratory, a rough chapel made of oak timbers cut from the forest itself. They lived in huts, rising before dawn, praying by candlelight, and spending daylight hours clearing brush, cutting stone, and diverting a small stream to power a mill. Every sound they made was swallowed by the valley. The rhythm of their days became indistinguishable from the turning of the seasons. Over the next decades, stone replaced timber. The monks learned from traveling masons, many of whom were former builders of cathedrals moving through Europe in search of work. The style they chose was Romanesque. Thick walls, round arches, narrow windows that admitted only soft angled light. Later generations would add Gothic elements, pointed arches, and higher vaults, but the original heart of the monastery remained squat, grounded, and quiet. It was architecture not meant to impress the world, but to endure it. The stones were quarried locally, from a ridge to the east. Even today, traces of those quarries remain, pits filled with rainwater, edged by ferns. Each block was cut by hand, lifted by pulleys and levers, shaped according to principles that had changed little since Roman times. The builders carved no names, no symbols of ownership, only small crosses on the undersides of certain, a humble mark of sanctity invisible once the walls were raised. When the church was complete, they built the cloister, the heart of monastic life. It was a square courtyard enclosed by covered walkways, each lined with simple columns. In the center grew a small garden of herbs, lavender, sage and rue. From there corridors led to the refectory, dormitory, chapter house, and library. Each space served a rhythm of life defined by hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers and compline. The bells cast by a local foundry rang for each prayer. The valley's silence became not emptiness but order, divided gently by sound and stillness in equal measure. By the mid-12th century, the monastery had become self-sustaining. The brothers tended orchards, brewed ale, kept bees, and maintained a small infirmary. They cultivated medicinal herbs, valerian, comfrey, and angelica, following recipes copied from monastic herbals like those of Hildegard of Bingen, whose writings were spreading through the German lands at the time. They also copied manuscripts in Latin, psalters, commentaries, and the occasional scientific treatise brought by travelers. Their scriptorium faced east to catch the morning light, and the scratching of quills echoed softly against stone. The monastery's connection to the outside world was faint but persistent. Peasants from nearby hamlets brought tithes in grain or livestock, and in return the brothers offered healing, blessings, and burial within consecrated ground. Once a year, a bishop or papal legate might visit, checking for heresy or laxity, though the valley's isolation often made such visits more symbolic than thorough. The monastery survived not by fame but by invisibility, yet even isolation could not keep the world entirely at bay. The 12th century was a time of crusades and reform. Kings and popes argued over the balance of power. Armies marched eastward under the sign of the cross. In the chronicles that survive, there are faint traces suggesting the monks sent small alms to the crusader states, not soldiers but prayers and modest coin. They remained loyal to Rome, even as heresy began to stir in distant provinces. Their faith was conservative, rooted in repetition and obedience. The founding documents, preserved in fragmentary copies, describe the valley as locus quietis, the place of quiet. That phrase would later appear in multiple charters across Europe, often associated with Cistercian and Benedictine houses seeking solitude. It encapsulated the ideal of the age that divine truth was not found in argument or conquest, but in silence, labor, and humility. In those early centuries when winter froze the fields and snow drifted against cloister walls, the brothers lit fires of peat and oak and continued their prayers. Their world was small, a ring of hills, a strip of sky, the rhythm of bells and the slow decay of candles. They measured time not in years but in hours of devotion. Their faith was not one of spectacle but of endurance, built stone by stone in a valley that asked for nothing but patience. And so the monastery stood, rising out of the mist like a thought-given shape, a sanctuary built not for the world's eyes, but for God's silence. Centuries would pass before its prayers began to fade, but already the seeds of decay were present in its perfection. For nothing built of stone and faith can ever fully resist the slow encroachment of time. The story of its daily life, the routines, the labor, the prayers that shaped every hour, unfolded quietly within those walls, where the sound of the outside world could barely reach. Within the monastery's grey walls, time did not flow so much as circle, gentle and repetitive, like the ripples that spread outward when a pebble touches water. Each day unfolded according to the same measured rhythm, crafted not by the world beyond the hills, but by the tolling of the bell and the unchanging demands of devotion. For the early brothers who lived here, life was not a sequence of events but a pattern, a woven fabric of prayer, labor, and silence. The day began before dawn, long before the valley stirred. In the darkness the bell rang for matins, the first of the canonical hours. The sound was low and hollow, carrying softly through corridors of cold stone. One by one, the monks rose from their straw-filled pallets in the dormitory, pulling rough wool habits over their thin linen shirts. Their garments were undyed, the greyish hue of natural wool, and coarse enough to remind the wearer that comfort was a fleeting vanity. They moved in silence, each man a shadow among shadows, the dim glow of oil lamps illuminating their way to the chapel. Outside, the world was nothing but mist and frost, the faint line of the stream glinting under the moonlight. Inside the chapel, their breath rose in clouds, mingling with the faint scent of wax and damp stone. There were no sermons at this hour, no words of instruction, only psalms chanted in Latin, their voices low and steady, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Domine, labia mea, aperis, et os mem anontia bit, laudem tuam. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth shall declare your praise. The chant rose and fell like the tide, a slow cadence that blurred the distinction between individual voices. The goal was not expression but unity, to dissolve oneself into the collective sound of devotion. For nearly an hour, they sang, and when it ended, there was no applause, no conclusion, only silence again, thick and holy. After matins came lauds, then a brief return to the dormitory. By the time the first pale light crept over the hills, the brothers gathered again for prime, the hour that marked the start of daily labor. Each monk had his duty, assigned by the abbot according to skill and need. Some tended the gardens, neat plots of leeks, onions, and medicinal herbs, while others worked in the bakery, the stables, or the mill. The scribe brothers took their places in the scriptorium, where the only sound was the scratch of quills and the occasional cough. The scriptorium faced east, as most did, to capture the morning light. The windows were narrow slits, allowing beams of gold to fall in long still columns across the tables. Sheets of parchment, made from the stretched skins of sheep or goats, lay weighted at the corners with smooth stones. Each brother prepared his ink, oak gall mixed with iron salts, and sharpened his quill with a small knife until the nib was fine enough to shape words no larger than grains of sand. They copied the Psalms, the Gospels, the writings of the Fathers, works that already existed in countless monasteries across Christendom, yet which had to be written again and again, as if faith itself depended upon repetition. To write was to pray with one's hands. Each stroke of the quill was deliberate, a slow tracing of meaning through time. Mistakes were scraped away with pumice, though every erasure left a faint scar, a reminder that even sacred work was fallible. Some brothers decorated the margins with delicate flourishes, vines, animals, abstract knots, though in this house, ornamentation was restrained. Their discipline forbade excess, beauty had to be quiet. At the sound of the bell, they laid down their tools and went to the refectory for their meal. It was never a feast, bread coarse with barley husks, a bowl of lentils or pottage, and a cup of thin ale brewed from their own grain. Meat was rare, reserved for feast days or the infirmary. The rule of Saint Benedict permitted simplicity and forbade waste. No one ate until full, and no one spoke. During meals, one monk read aloud from scripture or the lives of the saints, while the rest listened in silence. When the bell rang again, they bowed their heads and returned their bowls, the sound of their steps echoing against stone. The monastery's rhythm followed the seasons as faithfully as it followed the hours. In winter, the air in the cloisters was sharp and white with frost, the stone floors numbing to bare feet. They wore woolen cowls and fingerless gloves for their labor, yet the cold was constant, seeping into joints and lungs alike. In summer the gardens bloomed, bees hovered among lavender, and the brothers worked longer hours in the fields. The heat could be stifling in their habits, but they accepted it as part of their discipline. To endure was to imitate Christ. Inside the monastery, time seemed to stand still. The thick walls muffled the world. There were no sounds of markets, no shouts of traders or soldiers, only the slow rhythm of bells, the rustle of robes, the drip of water in the cloister fountain. To the brothers, this isolation was not punishment but perfection. They sought to remove themselves from worldly distraction, to live in a perpetual now, suspended between earth and eternity. Their conversations, when allowed, were sparse. The vow of silence was not absolute. They could speak briefly during certain hours, but most communication was through gesture or expression. Over the years, an informal sign language evolved, a hand to the chest for hunger, 2 fingers across the lips for prayer, a palm turned upward for request. Words they believed were too easily misused. Silence could not lie. At Vespers, as the day began to fade, they gathered once more in the chapel. Candles burned low, their flames trembling in the draughts that slipped through the cracks of the old stone. The chants were slower now, deeper in tone, filled with a sense of closing. Outside, the hills darkened, and mist pooled again in the valley. When the final bell marked compline, they filed into the dormitory in silence. Before sleep, each monk examined his conscience in private prayer, recalling any small failures of thought or temper. There was no confession here before others, only the unending internal dialogue with God. Then they lay down, side by side, in their narrow cots. The abbot made the rounds, ensuring all was still. Only the faint creak of wood and the sigh of wind through cracks accompanied the night. It was a life of unchanging repetition, yet within it, the brothers found a kind of peace. Days blurred into years without event. Faces aged quietly, hands grew calloused from labor and ink alike. They rarely saw strangers, rarely left the valley, and when death came, as it often did from fever or cold, they buried their own beneath the orchard, marking graves with unadorned stones. In this way, generations of monks lived and died here, unseen by history, sustained by their rhythm of prayer and work. Their existence was both anonymous and eternal, a living echo of the words written in their own manuscripts: stabilitas, loci, stability of place. They belonged not to the world, but to this small enclosure of faith, and yet even within such devotion, the faint edges of weariness could be felt. The endless sameness, the harsh winters, the quiet illnesses that crept through the dormitory, all were reminders that holiness was often indistinguishable from endurance. Still they persevered, as they always had, through the centuries that would follow, through times of famine, plague, and silence deeper than prayer. The monastery's peace would soon be tested, though none of the brothers could have foreseen it. The outside world, so distant, would one day find its way into their valley, not in battle, but in suffering carried by wind and breath. Under the vaulted ceiling, the air trembled faintly with the low hum of morning prayer. It was not music, not exactly, but a sound that seemed to reach back into the stone itself, as if the walls had learned to murmur in Latin after centuries of listening. The bell had rung before dawn, its tones spreading out across the valley like a ripple over still water. The mist had not yet lifted, and even within the chapel, its coolness clung to the monks' sleeves. In the half-light of early morning, shapes moved slowly, shadows of men who had long surrendered their individuality to rhythm, to duty, to the passing of hours marked not by choice but by ritual. Their world was not one of emotion, but of endurance. A monk might live 50 years within these walls and never once raise his voice. He would rise with the bell, wash in cold water, eat bread grown from their own fields, and then move wordlessly through the offices of prayer, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and finally compline. Each hour sanctified by repetition, the same verses offered to the same silence. The echo of their voices climbed the ribs of the stone vaults and disappeared into the dimness above. There was no congregation to hear them, no applause, no comfort of a smile. The reward was the act itself, devotion measured in persistence. Candlelight bled across the pages of manuscripts resting on the scriptorium's long tables. The air smelled faintly of wax and iron gall ink. Dust floated like a faint fog, stirred only by the movement of quills or the slow sweep of a robe's hem. Time did not rush here, it pooled. Each breath, each word, each scrape of parchment carried the same weight. The monastery's stones absorbed it all, the footsteps, the whispered prayers, the slow erosion of years. They bore the damp winters when frost bloomed across the inner walls, and the summers when the heat pressed thickly against the cloister walks. The brothers moved through it, as though submerged in a single continuous moment. They did not age in each other's eyes. They simply thinned, like the lines of a manuscript rubbed smooth from too much touch. The abbey's heart was its chapel. There, under the soft sway of hanging lamps, stood the choir stalls carved by long dead hands. Their wood was dark with polish and age, edges worn smooth by countless leanings. Between them, the brothers knelt, their heads bowed, lips moving in near silence. The psalms were familiar as breathing, each syllable sinking into memory deeper than thought. In the cloister garden, the first light of morning traced the outlines of stone arches. Dew clung to the grass, and the faint scent of herbs drifted from small neat beds, sage, mint, rue. The garden was both refuge and necessity, providing medicine and flavor to the otherwise plain diet of grain and lentil. Bees moved through it lazily, their low hum joining the endless litany of sound that shaped monastic life. To outsiders, those few who ever wandered this far, it was a life of stillness, almost absence. But to those within, there was meaning in the smallest acts, the polishing of a chalice, the illumination of a single letter in red or gold, the careful ringing of the bell. Each action was an offering, repeated not out of hope for reward, but out of reverence for the act itself. Yet beneath the peace there lingered a quiet awareness, a sense of where the stones, once bright and unblemished, had begun to darken with soot and age. Roofs leaked in heavy rains. The nearby forest, which once supplied timber, had thinned. Pilgrims came less often, their footsteps fading from the worn path. Some whispered that the age of great faith was dimming, that the noise of cities and the rising power of kings was swallowing the quiet places of the world. Inside, though, life continued undisturbed. The bell rang, the chants rose, candles flickered and died, replaced by others. The same meals were eaten, the same passages copied. The cycle was its own eternity, and for the brothers who lived it, there was no thought of beginning or end, only the steady rhythm of devotion, the unbroken breathing of prayer through time. Occasionally, when the day was finished and the last service done, one might walk the cloister in the thin light of dusk. There, in the stillness, the sound of prayer seemed to linger, not as echo, but as something woven into the air itself. The faint hiss of wind through the arches might almost form a word. The crack of cooling stone might almost sound like a sigh. If one stood still enough, they might imagine that the prayers of the dead and the living overlapped, a soft chorus in a language too ancient for meaning. It was in moments like these that the boundary between devotion and haunting blurred. The monastery was not empty, but neither was it fully alive. Time here did not move forward, it only deepened. Each generation layered its voice upon the last, building a soundless archive of longing, faith, and fatigue. The stones remembered everything. As years turned to decades, that weight of prayer, of repetition, of unending time began to shape more than the walls. It pressed into the people themselves, into the bones of those who lived and died here. The chants became instinct, their rhythm continuing even when the mouth was still. Some said that after death, a monk's voice did not vanish. It simply joined the hum that always seemed to hang over the chapel, neither wind nor memory, but something older. Outside, the world shifted. Kingdoms rose, borders changed, wars drew close, and yet the bell still rang, its sound muted by distance but unbroken. The brothers heard little of these changes. The weight of their own eternity was enough. Their devotion was steady, but their walls were not. Cracks appeared in stone, mold crept through the mortar, rain found its way inside. The sound of dripping water joined the liturgy of daily life. In that slow decay, the first true silence began to form, a silence that was not peaceful, but expectant. Something was changing, though none could name it. The sound of prayer still filled the chapel, but it seemed to fade a little sooner each morning, as if the walls were growing tired of holding it. And when the sun fell low across the valley and the mist rose again, the monastery stood as it always had, steadfast, grey, unmoved. Yet inside, beneath the rhythm of devotion, the air began to hum differently. The weight of time was shifting, pressing forward towards something unseen, something that even the oldest brothers could feel but not describe. Something was coming. The seasons that followed were not kind. The valley, once green and soft beneath the monastery's gaze, began to yellow under a sky that no longer promised rain. The fields grew brittle, their soil cracked and pale. The river that curled behind the abbey thinned into a sluggish ribbon, its banks littered with the bones of fish that could no longer find depth enough to swim. Even the birds grew scarce, and the wind, when it came, carried a faint dust that clung to everything, to robes, to pages, to skin. It was the year when hunger began to whisper through the cloisters. At first, the brothers accepted it as another test, another way to prove the patience of faith. Meals had always been sparse. Fasting was a discipline, but now, fasting was no longer chosen. The granary emptied more quickly than the harvest could fill it. Bread shrank in portion until each slice was a thin wafer, and the stew, once a modest comfort of lentils and herbs, became a mere murmur of flavor in a bowl of hot water. The silence deepened, the chanting continued, but the voices were weaker, their tones wavering like candles in a draught. Outside, the peasants who had once traded grain and honey for blessings stopped coming. Some had fled, others had simply vanished. Those who did appear at the monastery gates came not with goods but with hollow faces, begging for mercy or a crust of bread. The brothers gave what they could until they, too, had nothing left. It was not long before the first of them fell ill. No one could say what name the sickness had in those early months. It came quietly, like the onset of weariness, but its hold was relentless, a cough that deepened, a fever that burned beneath the skin, a darkness that crept from the lungs outward, staining the body with its invisible ink. They prayed, of course. They prayed as they always had, at dawn, at dusk, in every hour that still remained measured by the tolling of the bell. But prayer did not still the shivering, it did not close the eyes of those who died before sunrise. The abbey infirmary, once a place for the gentle tending of the old and frail, filled with the sound of labored breathing. The brothers moved among the beds in silence, their faces covered with cloth soaked in vinegar, their hands trembling as they anointed each brow with holy oil. The candles burned low, replaced so often that wax pooled across the flagstones. The smell of incense, once the scent of peace, grew heavy, oppressive, a disguise for decay. Beyond the valley, the world was unraveling. Rumors reached them even here, carried by the few who stumbled in seeking shelter, that villages lay empty, that carts piled high, with bodies creaked through city streets, that even kings had fled their halls. Some called it the Great Mortality. Others said it was God's wrath. No one agreed on where it had begun, in the ports, perhaps, or with the rats that ran along the trade routes. It did not matter. What mattered was that it was here now, in this quiet valley, where the only sound had once been the tolling of a bell. The monastery became both refuge and tomb. Peasants arrived in desperate clusters, dragging with them the sick, the dying, the already dead. The brothers opened their gates. They could do no less, and the cloister that had once echoed with the rhythm of ordered prayer became a place of chaos, of whispers, of coughing in the night. Every corner filled with bodies. Every cell became a chamber of suffering. The gardens withered, their herbs crushed beneath the feet of those seeking shelter. Even the great hall, where they once broke bread in solemn silence, became a resting place for the fevered. The bell rang often now, not for prayer, but for death. Its sound no longer signaled the rhythm of devotion, but the counting of loss. One toll for a brother, 2 for a villager, 3 for the children. It rang until the metal itself seemed to ache, until the valley's air was saturated with its grief. When the abbot himself fell ill, the remaining brothers gathered around his bed. He spoke little, only motioned weakly toward the chapel, and whispered a single word, "Continue, continue." And they did, even when the chapel was half empty, even when the voices had thinned to a frail harmony. They sang as if their sound could keep the darkness from closing in, as if the rhythm of Latin syllables could hold back the end of the world. Outside, carts arrived more frequently. Some were left at the gates, the drivers too afraid to enter. Inside, the brothers dug graves until the ground froze. Then they began to lay the dead in the crypt beneath the church, where the air was cooler. Soon there was no room left. The bones of the early founders, once carefully preserved in stone recesses, were joined by hundreds more. The line between relic and corpse blurred. By midwinter, the bell fell silent. Not because the dead no longer came, but because there was no one left to ring it. The few surviving monks moved like shadows through the corridors, their steps muffled by the dust and ash that clung to every surface. In the scriptorium, unfinished manuscripts lay open, ink frozen mid-stroke, as though the words themselves had succumbed. And then at last, even the chanting stopped. For the first time in centuries, the monastery was utterly still. No footsteps echoed, no prayers rose to the rafters. The wind slipped through the broken shutters and stirred the ashes of extinguished candles. Rats moved through the corridors, their small bodies brushing against robes that still hung from pegs, untouched. The chapel, once alive with voices, now held only the faint sound of dripping water. Days passed without witness. Then weeks. The valley lay under snow, white and soundless. The monastery stood at its heart like a monument to abandonment, a place both sacred and forgotten. When the spring thaw came, no one remained to see it. The doors of the abbey hung open, and the wind moved freely through its empty halls. In time, moss crept back across the stones, covering inscriptions, softening edges. Birds nested in the rafters, their chirping delicate and unbothered by the silence below. But though no living monk remained to chant or pray, the air did not forget. There were nights when travellers, those few who still passed through the valley, swore they heard the sound of distant bells, faint, uneven, as though rung by hands that no longer knew their own strength. Others said they heard chanting, far off and indistinct, like a memory repeating itself into the dark. The monastery had become what it was always destined to be, a vessel for echoes. The faith that had built it had not vanished. It had merely changed form, slipping into the stones, the shadows, the silence itself. And so the valley slept again, though not as it had before. The stillness was no longer pure, no longer peaceful. It was layered, haunted by the weight of everything that had been lost. The first meal after the plague ended was held in a hall that felt larger than it ever had before. The refectory, built to hold 40 men, now contained only 3. Their footsteps echoed in advance of them, a faint hollow rhythm that sounded louder than any chant ever had. The benches were empty, the tables bare save for 3 wooden bowls and a single loaf of coarse bread placed between them. Dust hung in the air, visible in the pale shafts of light that fell through cracked windows. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and the faint, sharp trace of mold. They did not speak. Words had long since lost their purpose. One of the brothers, the youngest, bowed his head before the bread and murmured the blessing. His voice trembled and broke halfway through, but the sound was absorbed by the vast silence. He tore the loaf and passed it to the others, his hands trembling not from piety, but from hunger. The bread was dry, the crust hard, but they ate it slowly, reverently, as though the act itself kept something human alive within them. The refectory had once been a place of quiet order. The brothers had dined in rows, listening to readings of scripture, the voice of the appointed lector rising softly over the scrape of spoons and the occasional cough. Now there was no lector, no reading, no rhythm, only the sound of chewing and the occasional shifting of a chair. The benches, once polished by decades of use, now sat unevenly, their wood warped by neglect and damp. The walls bore faint outlines where tapestries had once hung, stories of saints and martyrs, now reduced to pale ghosts of color. Outside, the valley had changed too. The fields were untended, the gardens wild. The grass grew tall and tangled, reclaiming paths once marked by the feet of pilgrims. The sound of bells had not returned. Birds nested in the belfry, their cries sharp against the stillness. The wind no longer carried the scent of cooking, or the faint sweetness of incense. It smelled instead of earth and decay. The surviving brothers moved through their days as if through ritualized memory. They rose at dawn and knelt before the altar, though no one answered their prayers. They worked in silence, repairing what they could, patching roofs, clearing debris, but their efforts were half-hearted, motions without conviction. When the day ended, they gathered again in the refectory, not because they were hungry, but because they did not know what else to do. It was there, in that echoing hall, that the weight of absence was most tangible. Every chair that stood empty seemed to hum faintly with memory. The brothers found themselves glancing toward places where others had once sat, expecting movement, a gesture, the clearing of a throat, but there was nothing. Only the draught that slipped through the cracks in the windows and stirred the edges of their robes. Sometimes, when the light fell in a certain way, one of them thought he saw motion in the far corner, the suggestion of a figure seated where none remained. Once the youngest claimed to hear the sound of utensils faintly striking bowls, though his own hands were still. They said nothing of it to one another. The monastery had become a place where silence was safer than truth. Meals grew simpler still, a handful of barley, a thin broth flavored with whatever could be gathered from the overgrown garden. The taste was unimportant. Eating was no longer an act of sustenance, but a ceremony of remembrance. Each spoonful honored those who had once filled the hall with presence. It was as if the survivors were eating for the dead, preserving the rhythm of life so that the ghosts could rest in it. At night, when the brothers left the refectory and crossed the cloister toward their cells, their footsteps sounded unnaturally loud against the stone. The moonlight cast long, shifting shadows that seemed to follow them. Sometimes they stopped and turned, certain someone walked behind, but the walkway was empty. Only the faint drip of water from the eaves broke the silence. In the stillness, the mind began to betray itself. Dreams grew vivid, heavy with voices that spoke in half-remembered prayers. The youngest often woke to the sound of murmuring beyond his door, like the old meal readings continuing without him. He would rise, open the door, and find the corridor empty. But once, when he leaned close to the stone, he swore he could feel the faint vibration of words moving through it, as though the walls themselves had learned to pray in place of the lost. The refectory became a shrine to persistence. The remaining brothers continued to set places for those who were gone, bowls, cups and spoons laid neatly in rows across the long tables. Each item was cleaned carefully, replaced in the same spot each day. It was as though order could ward off oblivion. The room, though abandoned in truth, was never allowed to descend fully into ruin. To leave it so would be to admit defeat, and none dared to name the end. Seasons passed. The snow melted and returned again. Moss grew thick along the base of the walls. The roof sagged, and the corners darkened with damp. The three brothers aged quietly, their faces hollowing, their robes growing threadbare. Their world shrank to the measure of candlelight and the slow ticking of days. They prayed not for salvation, but for continuation, for the strength to endure another meal, another dawn. And yet, for all the decay, the refectory remained the heart of the monastery. It was there that the living and the dead seemed closest. There the weight of time pressed most heavily, and there perhaps the first true haunting began, not of vengeance or unrest, but of memory refusing to fade. Some evenings, as twilight bled through the high windows, the faint sound of movement could be heard, the shifting of benches, the creak of wood, the whisper of robes against stone. The brothers would sit in silence, heads bowed, pretending not to notice. It was easier to believe the wind was playing tricks than to acknowledge what their hearts already knew, that they were no longer alone in this hall. The monastery's purpose had changed. It no longer belonged to the living, but neither did it belong entirely to the dead. It had become something in between, a vessel for memory, a keeper of ritual. The refectory, once a place of community, was now a stage for echoes. The three who remained continued their meals beneath the gaze of unseen company, their small circle dwarfed by emptiness. And as each candle burned down to its wick, the shadows seemed to lean closer, as if listening, as if waiting for their turn to eat. The wind outside sighed against the shutters, and somewhere in the distance a single bell rang, not from a human hand, but from the shifting of air through broken metal. It was a thin sound, uncertain, but it carried through the valley like a memory calling itself back into being. The winter that year came earlier than it should have. Frost descended before the harvest could be gathered, and the valley fell once again under its familiar shroud of silence. The monastery stood unchanged, grey and patient, its stone walls streaked by centuries of weather. Inside, the three surviving brothers carried on their rituals with mechanical precision: morning prayer, meagre meals, the tending of dwindling candles. They had long ceased marking days. Time had become circular, each dawn indistinguishable from the last. It was during one of these featureless evenings, when the light had thinned to blue and the first flakes of snow drifted through the cloister, that a faint knock echoed from the gate. The sound, alien and unexpected, startled the brothers more than thunder would have. They exchanged brief, wordless glances, the kind born of long habit, and moved toward the sound. The visitor was a lone pilgrim. His cloak was heavy with frost, his boots stiff with mud from roads half forgotten by travelers. His beard was rimmed with ice, and his eyes, hollowed by hunger, held the distant light of someone who had walked too long with only silence for company. When the gate opened, he bowed his head, not from reverence, but exhaustion. The eldest monk studied him for a moment, then gestured him inside. No words were exchanged. Speech felt unnecessary here, and perhaps, in some quiet way, forbidden. The pilgrim followed, his steps hesitant as he crossed the threshold into the cloister. The air inside was colder than it should have been. Even the pilgrim noticed a damp, still chill that seemed to cling not only to the walls, but to the breath itself. The corridors smelled faintly of stone and old wax, and his footsteps echoed in strange ways, bouncing off the walls as though returning from impossible angles. The monks led him to the refectory, where a fire burned weakly in the hearth, more smoke than flame. They offered him food, a thin broth and a crust of bread, and he accepted with quiet gratitude. The brothers ate beside him without conversation, their heads bowed, their movements slow. To the pilgrim, their silence felt not peaceful but deliberate, as though sound itself might disturb something best left undisturbed. He watched them from the corner of his eye. Their faces were pale, almost translucent in the firelight. Their eyes, when they lifted, seemed unfocused, as if fixed on something beyond the room. After the meal, one of the monks motioned for him to follow. They led him to a small cell near the edge of the cloister. The room was simple, a wooden cot, a cross of tarnished metal, a single candle placed on a rough table. The pilgrim thanked them softly, though no reply came. As the door closed behind him, he heard their footsteps retreat down the corridor, slow, even, unbroken. And then nothing. For a while he lay still, listening. The wind outside whispered against the shutters, carrying the faint sound of snow brushing against the walls. Somewhere deeper in the building, a door creaked, though the sound came from no direction he could name. He assumed it was the monks, night prayers perhaps, but when he listened more closely, the rhythm of the steps seemed uneven, as though one of them was walking with a limp. When he finally slept, his dreams were filled with indistinct murmurs, voices chanting in Latin, distant and muffled, rising and falling like waves. He woke more than once to the sense of someone standing near the bed, though each time the candle still burned low, untouched. The air, however, felt disturbed, faintly stirred, like the breath of a sigh that had not yet faded. The next morning, the monastery was shrouded in fog. He found the monks already in the chapel, kneeling before the altar. The faint light from the narrow windows gave their figures a spectral quality, outlines without color, forms half merged with the shadows. Their chanting was low and steady, but the words were indistinct, swallowed by the echo. The pilgrim knelt at the back, uncertain whether to join them. The sound moved strangely through the room, as if the voices came from beneath the floor, or within the walls. At one point, he could have sworn he heard an additional voice, higher, thinner, almost childlike, weaving between the others. But when he opened his eyes, the monks remained unchanged, their lips moving in perfect unison. After the service, he lingered near the entrance. The cold seemed thicker here, rising from the stones like breath. The candlelight shivered though there was no draught. He noticed that several of the pews were covered in dust, their surfaces undisturbed for years, perhaps decades. And yet, faint impressions marked the floor beside them, as if knees had pressed there recently, leaving ghostly indentations in the dust. He turned toward one of the brothers, meaning to ask how many of them still lived in this place, but the monk had already moved away, his steps silent. That evening, as snow gathered against the windows, the pilgrim found himself walking through the cloister alone. The sound of his own footsteps seemed to multiply, reflected and distorted by the corridors, until it felt as though he were being followed. Once, when he stopped, the echo continued for a heartbeat longer than it should have. A second pair of steps lingering after his own had ended. He told himself it was the acoustics, old stone and narrow halls playing tricks on tired senses, and yet, when he passed the refectory, he caught a glimpse through the doorway, the three monks seated at the table, heads bowed, hands still. The fire had gone out, and yet their faces were faintly illuminated by a light he could not see the source of. He did not enter. Later that night, unable to sleep, he walked again toward the chapel. The door was ajar, and within, the faint glow of candlelight flickered. He hesitated at the threshold. Inside, the altar was set, but the monks were nowhere to be seen. The candles burned steadily, though their wax had melted into uneven rivers along the stone. And yet, beneath the sound of the dripping wax, beneath the faint creak of the rafters, there was something else, a hum, low, steady, rhythmic. It was the sound of prayer, not loud enough to be words, but unmistakably human in its pattern. It rose and fell in the same cadence he had heard in his dreams, the same that echoed through his bones when he first entered this place. He stood there for a long time, uncertain whether to cross the threshold. Eventually, he turned away and returned to his cell. When dawn came, he packed his few belongings and left without a word. The monks did not see him off. The gate was unbarred, as though expecting his departure. As he walked down the hill and the monastery faded into mist, he looked back once, just once, and saw a faint figure standing in the tower window. The shape was motionless, its outline blurred by fog. It could have been one of the brothers. It could have been something else. By the time he reached the road, he was certain of only one thing, that the silence of that place was not empty. It was watching. The pilgrim's departure should have marked the end of that strange encounter, but his journey through the frozen hills had not taken him far before the weight of unease compelled him to turn back. There was something unfinished about his visit, a feeling that the monastery still held a truth hidden behind its walls, as if it had not yet released him. The valley, draped in fog, seemed almost to draw him back, its silence dense and expectant, and so by the following dusk, his weary feet once again pressed into the path that wound toward the grey silhouette of the abbey. The gates were open, though he saw no one. The courtyard was untouched, save for a scatter of withered leaves caught in the corners of the cloister. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned the place. When he entered, the air felt thicker than before, stale but charged with something that hovered just beyond perception. The cold, too, seemed deeper, no longer a natural chill but something that emanated from the stones themselves. Inside, the monastery lay in half-darkness. The monks were nowhere to be seen, though the faint sound of distant chanting drifted through the corridors, disembodied and slow. It might have been the wind, or it might have been prayer. The pilgrim followed the sound, his steps echoing softly against the flagstones, until he reached a narrow passage behind the refectory, one he had not noticed before. The corridor sloped gently downward, its walls lined with rough-hewn stone. A faint draught whispered upward, carrying the dry scent of dust and age. The deeper he went, the more the air seemed to thicken, until the darkness itself felt almost tangible. At the end of the passage he found a small iron gate, half rusted and slightly ajar. Beyond it, a stairwell spiraled into deeper shadow. He descended slowly, his hand trailing along the damp wall. The sound of his breath grew louder in the confined space. When he reached the bottom, the stair opened into a low chamber, the air motionless, the silence absolute. His candlelight revealed bones, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, arranged not in heaps or piles, but in careful, deliberate patterns. Skulls lined the walls like bricks. Femurs and ribs had been woven into geometric shapes, spirals and arches that mirrored the vaulted ceilings of cathedrals. In the center of the room, a great cross made entirely of vertebrae rose from the floor. Every bone was bleached white and polished by time. He stood there, motionless, trying to understand. The sight was beautiful in a way that defied explanation, a terrible order imposed upon death. But beneath that order, there was something more troubling, the sense that these remains had not merely been stored here, but revered. In medieval Europe, ossuaries were not uncommon. Cemeteries filled quickly, and the earth could not always contain the dead. Monks, particularly those of older orders, had long practiced the art of bone arrangement, a form of devotion, a meditation on mortality. The bones of the faithful were never discarded, but gathered, cleansed and set in sacred geometry. They served as both remembrance and warning, as we are, so shall you be. And yet, this place felt different. Most ossuaries bore inscriptions, blessings, or prayers carved into their walls, invocations for eternal rest. But here there were none, no scripture, no symbols, no sign of reverence, only the patterns themselves, intricate and precise, as if created by hands more concerned with symmetry than sanctity. He walked deeper into the chamber. The bones seemed to hum faintly in the silence, a pressure in the air that grew stronger with every step. His candle flickered, though there was no wind. Shadows moved strangely, stretching across the walls in shapes that did not match his own. At the far end of the ossuary, he found a smaller alcove, half collapsed, and filled with fragments of shattered skulls. In the center lay a stone slab, carved roughly with a symbol he could not recognize. It was circular, composed of interlocking arcs that spiraled inward. He knelt beside it, brushing away dust. Beneath the grime, faint lines of Latin were visible, fratres in silentio aeterno, brothers in eternal silence. The phrase sent a coldness through him that had nothing to do with the air. It was not a dedication, but a sentence, a statement that the silence of this place was not peace, but permanence. He realized then that the bones were not only of monks. Many of the skulls bore signs of violence, fractures, deep cuts, shattered jaws. Some were smaller, finer, perhaps those of women or children. This was not merely a monastic ossuary. It was a grave of indiscriminate dead. He stepped back, his breath unsteady. The candle trembled in his hand, casting uneven light across the room. For a moment he thought he saw movement in the shadows, a flicker between the arches, like the motion of robes swaying in unseen wind. But when he turned fully, there was only the stillness again. The silence pressed against him, heavy and watchful. He could almost feel the presence of the countless lives that had ended here, their remains arranged not by piety, but perhaps by penance or fear. The medieval monks who lived through the Black Death often believed the dead must be honored not only through burial but through preservation, their bones a testament to divine will. Yet others, faced with death too vast to understand, turned to ritual as a form of control. The geometry of bones became a language of desperation, a way to impose meaning where none could be found. The pilgrim remained there for what felt like hours, though time meant little in that place. He thought of the monks above, their pale faces, their voiceless prayers. How many of them knew of this chamber? How many had built it, or were entombed within it? When he finally climbed the stair again, the air of the cloister felt almost warm by comparison. But the quiet had changed, deeper now, heavier, as though the monastery itself knew he had seen what lay beneath its foundations. The chanting had stopped. Even the faint wind through the windows was gone. As he walked toward his cell, he passed through the refectory once more. There on the table lay 3 bowls. Each was filled with water, perfectly still, and reflected in that stillness, though the room was empty, were the faces of 4 men. He looked up quickly, but saw only the long shadows of the rafters stretching across the walls. That night he did not sleep. The sound of the bones seemed to follow him, a faint whisper of movement beneath the floor, a settling of stone, a hollow murmur just beyond hearing. The monastery, it seemed, was not built upon holy ground. It was built upon memory. And memory, when buried too deeply, does not rest. The winter deepened, snow gathered along the cloister's arches and hung heavy on the chapel roof, muting even the faintest sound. Days lost their distinction. The bell, cracked and rusted, no longer rang. Only the faint rhythm of chanting, if it could still be called that, drifted through the corridors, blending with the low sigh of wind beneath the doors. In one of the monastery's forgotten wings stood the library, a long, narrow hall lined with shelves of uneven wood, their edges darkened by centuries of candle smoke. Dust lay thick on the manuscripts, and cobwebs spanned the corners like delicate lace. The smell was unmistakable, a mingling of wax, mildew, and ancient parchment. Few entered this place any more. Fewer still understood what lay within, but one brother did. He was known only as the librarian, though his true name had long since been swallowed by the years. He was older than the others, his face drawn and his voice scarcely used. His fingers, stained with ink, trembled faintly when he wrote, but his script was still precise, still beautiful. It was said that he had once copied entire Gospels from memory, each letter formed with reverence bordering on devotion, yet his reverence had slowly shifted, not toward God, but toward the written word itself. The monastery's library, though small, was ancient. It held the expected works, psalters, breviaries, and the rule of Saint Benedict. But tucked between these were other volumes, ones that should not have survived inquisitorial purges. Some had no titles, others were fragments, written in languages no one could entirely decipher. The librarian had gathered them quietly over the decades, trading with passing monks, preserving what others sought to burn. There were texts of the Apocrypha, the Book of Enoch, with its visions of fallen angels, the Acts of Thomas describing a paradise at the edge of the world, and still others unnamed and unrecorded, filled with ink faded to near invisibility. One spoke of souls that could not ascend because the ground itself held them. Another told of monasteries where prayer was said not for salvation, but to keep something contained beneath the earth. The librarian copied them all. He wrote by candlelight deep into the night, the faint scratching of his quill echoing down the empty corridors. Sometimes, when his ink ran dry, he used blood, just enough to keep the script alive. His brethren noticed his absence from the refectory, from the chapel, from confession. When they asked where he was, the eldest monk would simply murmur that he was tending to the records. None pressed further. In time, the librarian stopped speaking altogether. He communicated only through his notes, left neatly on the desks outside the library, requests for wax, for parchment, for oil. His hand was still steady, his Latin perfect, but the margins of his later writings began to fill with strange annotations, lines written upside down, mirror script, or composed entirely of circles and lines. Then came the winter when he vanished. No one heard his departure. One morning his cell was empty, his bed unslept in, a candle still burned beside an open page, its wax long melted and hardened again. The others searched the cloister, the chapel, the gardens now buried under snow. Only the library remained. When they entered, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, as if the room had not been opened for months. The candles he had used were burned down to their bases, leaving black rivulets of wax along the shelves. Every book lay open, pages fanned as though caught in a wind that had since died, and on the central table where the librarian usually worked, a new manuscript lay waiting. It was bound in dark leather, untitled, its edges uneven. The ink was still wet. The handwriting was his, at least, at first, but as the text progressed, it changed. The neat, deliberate Latin gave way to symbols, looping and broken, as though written by an unsteady hand in the throes of vision or fever. The final page was blank, save for a single line scrawled at the bottom, ad librum descende. I went down into the book. The monks closed the library door after that. They barred it, though none could say why. Some claimed the silence behind it was too deep, not the stillness of emptiness, but of waiting. Others whispered that at night, when the wind rose, the pages inside turned by themselves, a faint rustle echoing through the walls like the breath of someone unseen. Years passed. The new brothers who came to the monastery, few though they were, heard only fragments of the tale, that the librarian had gone mad, that he had written a heretical text and been taken away, that his bones now rested beneath the floor of the ossuary, arranged among the others. But the older monks said nothing. They knew that the door to the library had never been opened again, though sometimes, when walking past it, one could hear the faintest sound of quill on parchment. In medieval monastic life, the role of the scribe was sacred. To copy scripture was to preserve divine truth, a task equal to prayer, yet the boundary between devotion and obsession was thin. Some chroniclers, isolated for decades in scriptoria, began to believe their own writings possessed a life beyond them. Marginalia became confessions, corrections became prayers, and sometimes entire passages were added in a hand that was not their own. Scholars now know of such texts, illuminated manuscripts, where the ink changes tone mid-sentence, or where unfamiliar glyphs appear as if from nowhere. The librarian's work fit this pattern perfectly, though few would ever see it again. The brothers carried on, praying beside locked doors, pretending not to hear the occasional flutter that drifted down the corridor. They said that the library had become his cell now, or perhaps his tomb. A few, in whispers, suggested something else entirely, that he had written himself into the text, that in his obsession he had sought communion not with God, but with the silence that existed before creation, and that it had answered. Sometimes, in the dim hours before dawn, the youngest monk would pass by the library door and pause. From within came the faintest scratching sound, not random, not animal, but rhythmic, a pen against paper. And though no candle burned there, a thin line of light sometimes appeared beneath the threshold, pulsing softly like breath. He never stayed long enough to see if it faded or grew. The manuscript itself, the one found on the table, was said to contain the words of the dead. The brothers, unable to destroy it, sealed it within the wall beside the door, binding it with wax and prayer. But over the years, the plaster cracked. Dust began to gather along the fissures, and when the wind passed through the cloister, it carried with it the dry, papery scent of old parchment, as though the library still exhaled, gently, from the inside. In time, no one mentioned the librarian again, yet every brother knew, in the private chambers of his mind, that the silence of the monastery had deepened since that winter. It was not the absence of sound, but its echo, the space left by something still listening. Snow still fell over the valley, though centuries had passed since any living monk had walked its cloisters. The monastery had long been abandoned, its walls softened by moss, its roof sagging beneath the weight of unbroken winters. The chapel bell, cracked and hollow, hung silent above a courtyard that now lay open to the sky. Grass and wildflowers grew where flagstones once gleamed under candlelight, and yet the valley had not forgotten. The villagers who lived miles away still spoke of the monastery in hushed tones, their words careful, their eyes averted when dusk drew near. To them it was not a ruin, but a threshold, a place where the world of the living brushed against something older, something that refused to fade. At the edge of every telling came the same detail, always spoken last, as though the words themselves carried unease, the candle that never died. It was said that, on certain nights, when fog rolled thick through the valley, or when snow fell so heavily that sound itself seemed to vanish, a faint light could be seen in the uppermost window of the old library, not the wild, shifting glow of fire or storm, but a single steady flame, pale, unwavering, constant. Those who had seen it said it burned too still to be natural, and too bright to be moonlight. Children were told the stories first, as warnings. Don't wander into the valley after sunset, for the monk still writes. The elder who told it always began the same way. Long ago there was a scribe who loved his books more than his brothers, and so the words kept him. According to the tales, the candle's flame was no ordinary light. It was said to be the soul of the librarian himself, trapped, unspent, writing still in the silence he had chosen. Each flicker of that distant glow marked another line written, another page turned by hands that no longer needed flesh. The villagers said that when the flame dimmed, storms followed, and when it brightened, someone in the valley would die. The rational ones dismissed it all, of course. They said the stories were born from wind and reflection, that the pale shimmer seen from afar was nothing more than starlight caught in broken glass, or phosphorescent moss clinging to the stones. But even they spoke softly when they passed the road leading toward the monastery, especially in winter, when the valley was hushed beneath snow, and the air carried the faint smell of old smoke. From time to time, curious souls went to see for themselves. Young men, mostly, shepherds, hunters, those emboldened by ale or bravado, they would climb the path by lantern light, swearing to find the truth, and though a few reached the gates and returned, they never stayed long enough to see the dawn. They all said the same thing, that the candle was real, that the window glowed softly even when the wind howled and no glass remained to shelter a flame, and that, when they drew near, they heard it, the faintest sound of a quill upon parchment. No one ever tried to enter the library. The doors were sealed by time, the stones fused by frost, but it was said that those who lingered outside too long began to hear whispering, not speech, exactly, but a pattern, as if the walls themselves remembered the rhythm of prayer. Historians who came centuries later found records of the monastery, sparse, fragmented, but enough to tell a shape of its life and death. They found mention of the plague that had emptied its halls, of the ossuary beneath, and of a brother whose name was struck from the records. In one tattered document, a chronicler had added a note in the margin, Librarius illi quiscripsit ultra mortem, that librarian who wrote beyond death. The legend grew over generations, reshaped by each retelling. Some said the librarian had discovered a way to bind the human soul to ink and vellum, that the candle burned not from wax, but from words. Others said the flame was divine punishment, the eternal light of a man who had tried to steal the language of angels. There were even those who believed the candle was a warning, a vigil left by unseen hands to mark a place that should never again be opened. In medieval superstition, candles had long symbolized the soul's endurance beyond death. Monks were often buried with them, their wax meant to light the path of the departing spirit. In rare cases, when a candle refused to extinguish after a death, it was taken as a sign that the soul lingered, trapped between worlds, unfinished. The villagers, perhaps unknowingly, echoed this belief. No one dared enter the valley after dark anymore. But every so often, someone, a traveler lost on the mountain roads, or a shepherd who'd stayed too long in the pasture, would glance across the fields at night and see that solitary glow. Some swore it pulsed faintly, as though it breathed. Others said it flickered in rhythm, not like flame, but like heartbeat. In the 19th century, when scholars from the city began to take interest in ruins and relics, a small expedition reached the monastery. They wrote of collapsed walls and eroded towers, of carvings half buried in moss. Their report, now preserved in an archive, mentions something peculiar, a candle stub found upon a wooden desk, hardened into the grain as though fused there by great heat. Its wick was untouched, blackened but never burned. When they removed it, the air in the library changed, growing colder, heavier, as if the room had been holding its breath. That night, as the scholars camped in the valley below, one of them woke to find the library window alight again. He climbed the hill to see for himself, but by the time he reached the gate, the flame was gone. In its place he found a scrap of parchment caught against the stones, written in a hand no modern scholar could identify. Only 3 words remained legible: "Still I write." He left the next morning and never returned. The monastery, left to its slow decay, stands even now, though only the lower walls remain. The villagers still see the candle sometimes, especially in midwinter when the air grows still and the moon is pale. They say it burns for those who cannot sleep, those who listen too long to the silence, and sometimes when the wind is just right, the faint smell of ink drifts down from the ruins, sharp, metallic, unmistakable, as if the pen still moves, as if the story is not yet finished. The end did not come with fire or siege, but with parchment, a royal seal pressed into wax, and a few lines of command that unmade centuries of devotion. The king's decree rode in on horseback, carried by men who neither knelt nor prayed. They brought not swords but ledgers, not crosses but quills. They came to count what could be sold: chalices, bells, vestments, even the very stones that had echoed with prayer. And so began the quietest kind of death, one written in ink. The brothers gathered in the courtyard as they had for generations, but the sound was wrong. No bells called them, no chant rose to the rafters, only the murmur of officials tallying relics, measuring silver, noting how much land lay fallow. The abbot stood at the gate, his face pale and still. He had led men through plague and famine, through years when faith itself had seemed to tremble, but this he could not fight. By royal order the monastery was to be dissolved. The word itself felt surgical, clean, bloodless, but what it meant was ruin. They stripped the altars first, prying loose the gold leaf from the saints' faces. The choir stalls were dismantled plank by plank, the relics sealed in crates and marked for the treasury. In the scriptorium, parchment curled in the damp, ink fading before any hand could save it. The great library, where the air once smelled of beeswax and vellum, fell into shadow. Shelves that had borne knowledge for lifetimes were emptied in days. Some monks left quietly, returning to distant families who scarcely remembered them. Others lingered, wandering the cloisters as though expecting the bells to ring again. A few refused to leave at all. One was found kneeling in the chapel long after the doors had been barred, lips moving soundlessly in the dust. When the officials finally departed, they left behind silence, vast, aching, and complete. The fields grew wild again, the cloisters filled with weeds, birds nested where prayers had once risen, rain pooled in the chapter house, and ivy crept through the broken arches like green fire. What centuries of faith had built, the crown's ink had undone, and yet, in that ruin, something lingered. Travellers who passed by in the years that followed said they heard faint chanting in the dawn mist, or saw candlelight flicker in windows that no longer had glass. The villagers said the monks never truly left, that their prayers still clung to the stones, repeating through the centuries like breath caught between worlds. By the time the next generation came of age, the monastery was no more than a husk, a skeleton of faith. But on still nights, when the moon hung low and the world was utterly silent, even the most hardened men swore they could hear it, the echo of a bell tolling somewhere deep in the ruins, counting not the hours of life, but the measure of loss, and then the sound would fade, leaving only the whisper of wind through hollow walls, the last prayer of a world dissolved. When the last of the brothers vanished into history, the valley did not weep for them, it simply continued to breathe, as it always had, in cycles of mist and frost and rain. The monastery, abandoned and unblessed, settled deeper into itself. The doors no longer opened, the bells no longer called, and the silence, once sacred, became something older, something belonging not to man, but to the earth. The first reclaimers were small and patient. Moss began to gather at the edges of the cloisters, softening the hard geometry of carved stone. Rainwater trickled through cracks that no mason's hand remained to repair. The ivy came next, its tendrils slithering like slow green veins across the walls. It did not rush, it did not need to. For centuries it climbed, curling around columns, winding into windows, pulling the stones tighter together, as though to keep the ruin warm. The valley had always been damp, but now it seemed almost alive with moisture. Joe clung to the arches long after sunrise. Fungi bloomed in the corners of the refectory, where the monks had once taken their silent meals. In time, even the crucifix above the altar was draped in creeping vines, its wooden Christ half hidden beneath the living green. It was not desecration, not exactly. It was simply the world remembering itself. The owls came with the ivy. They found hollow places in the belfry, where once the ropes had swung, and they nested there, silent as ghosts. In winter, they watched the snow drift through the open roof of the chapel. Their calls at night replaced the echoes of chants, long low sounds that rolled through the valley and settled in the hollows where men once knelt. The rain grew heavier in the years that followed, and the roof tiles began to fall. Each one landed with a dull sound, like a heartbeat in slow decay. Inside the scriptorium, the floorboards gave way, collapsing into the darkness of the crypt below. Rats scurried across the remains of old manuscripts, their tiny claws tracing the letters of prayers no one would ever read again. Yet, despite all this, the monastery did not die. It transformed. In spring, the cloisters became gardens once more, not of herbs and flowers, but of wild grasses that bent under the weight of rain. Small bluebells rose between the paving stones, and the air filled with the soft drone of bees. In the refectory, sunlight pooled through the broken roof, illuminating the dust like gold suspended in time. Sometimes, when the wind passed through the long corridors, it seemed to hum, low and steady, almost like chanting. Travelers began to appear again, not monks, not pilgrims, but wanderers. They came out of curiosity, or superstition, or simply because the path through the valley was quiet. Some camped near the gatehouse and left by morning, claiming to have heard voices in the night. Others said they found the walls warm to the touch, even under frost, as though the stone itself remembered the heat of devotion. None stayed long. The monastery tolerated visitors, as it tolerated the ivy, with indifference. Generations passed like seasons, empires shifted, kings died, and languages changed. The valley remained constant. Its isolation preserved the ruin better than care ever could. No new roads were cut here, no villages built nearby. It was too far from trade, too wet, too haunted, perhaps. The local farmers avoided it, and even the shepherds kept their flocks at a distance. When their children asked why, they would shrug and say that the ground near the old monastery had a sound to it, a kind of deep, steady hum beneath the soil, like the echo of something still breathing. By the 18th century, the ruin was half swallowed by the landscape. Ivy covered the southern wall entirely. From a distance, it looked less like a building and more like a hill, a mound of green and stone shaped by memory rather than design. The bell tower had long since fallen, its stones scattered like teeth across the grass. In one of its broken arches, a young oak had taken root, its trunk widening each year, pushing the carved stones farther apart. At night, moonlight turned the place silver. The wind moved through the empty windows like water, flowing softly, reshaping sound. In winter, frost traced delicate patterns across the worn carvings of saints and angels. Their faces, eroded by time, seemed both alive and gone, caught between presence and memory. Occasionally, antiquarians came to study the site. They took measurements, sketched the remaining architecture, and noted that the cloisters were built in a style typical of the late 12th century, early Gothic, modest but elegant. They found fragments of colored glass in the earth and pieces of tile that hinted at once rich floors. In a report, one wrote that the monastery was likely small but well built, its seclusion deliberate, its faith unyielding. He noted also that the ivy made it difficult to tell where the building ended and the landscape began. That, he said, is its most haunting quality. By the time those sketches were filed away in dusty archives, the ruin had already shifted again. The earth beneath it, softened by centuries of rain, began to sink. The crypts filled with water each spring, and frogs made their homes there. The old refectory, where the last surviving brothers had once eaten in silence, collapsed entirely one winter under the weight of snow. The echo of its fall rolled through the valley like thunder, startling the roosting birds, and still the ivy grew. Some of its tendrils reached deep into the stone, anchoring themselves in the cracks. Others spread outward, wrapping the walls in living lace. The green softened every corner, blurred every edge. It was as if nature had decided not to destroy the monastery, but to hold it, to weave it into its own slow rhythm. When rain fell, the sound it made upon the leaves and stone was almost like the murmur of monks at prayer, and when the mist came down the valley, as it always did, it wrapped around the ruins so gently that the outlines of the walls seemed to shift, less a building than an idea of one, a ghost made of weather and time. In that quiet, the monastery existed in two worlds. To the eye, it was ruin, broken, fading, half consumed, but to the valley, to the moss, and the ivy, and the rain, it was still alive, still part of the slow, eternal breathing of the land, and in that breath, if one listened carefully enough, there was still rhythm, still echo, still the faintest suggestion of prayer. By the time the 18th century found the valley again, the monastery had long ceased to be a destination. It was not marked on most maps, and even those who lived within sight of its crumbling tower spoke of it only in passing, as one might speak of a hill or a weather pattern. It was simply there, part of the land, mute and inevitable. The few who still went near it were shepherds looking for lost sheep, or children testing the edges of their fear. But one spring, after a winter of heavy rain, the ground around the southern wall began to shift. The river that wound through the valley swelled beyond its banks, softening the fields until the earth itself seemed to breathe beneath the farmer's boots. His name was Thomas Gellard, a plain man, neither superstitious nor scholarly. His farm lay on the far side of the valley, where the soil was good for barley, and the hills shielded the fields from the worst of the wind. The monastery's ruin stood within his grazing land, a dark shape he had passed countless times without a second glance. But that morning, the ground near the outer cloister looked strange, the grass slumped, the soil sagging, as if something beneath had moved. At first he thought it might be an animal burrow, or perhaps a sinkhole caused by the recent floods. He took his spade and went to investigate. The earth was damp and heavy, and it took him several minutes of digging before the blade struck something solid, not stone exactly, but something smoother, colder. He knelt, brushing away the soil with his hands until a pale curve emerged, faintly yellow in the sunlight. Bone. He hesitated. It was not the first time bones had been found in those fields. The valley had held men long before his time, but this one was strange, smooth, clean, almost delicate. He dug again more carefully now, widening the hole. Soon there were more bones, ribs, a skull, and the remains of a wooden box rotted almost to dust. Among the fragments lay something else, a small chalice, blackened with age, but still glinting faintly where the metal showed through. Thomas stared at it for a long moment. He knew what it was, or what it had been. The stories said the monks had buried their dead within the walls, sometimes even beneath the floors of their own chapel. But this was outside the building, beneath open soil, as though whoever had been buried here had been placed apart. He carried the chalice home, wrapped in his coat. That evening, as he cleaned the dirt from its surface by the light of his hearth, he noticed faint markings along the rim, not letters he recognized, but the remnants of some inscription, worn smooth by centuries of decay. By morning, word had spread. The villagers came to see, each bringing their own version of the story. Some said Thomas had disturbed a monk's grave, and that the dead would not rest easy now that their relics were in mortal hands. Others claimed that the ground near the monastery had always been cursed, that nothing sown there would grow, and that strange lights were sometimes seen at night above the ruins. When one of the children fell ill later that week, whispers began. The old women crossed themselves when Thomas passed in the lane. A few men suggested he bury the chalice again, or better yet, return it to the ruin and leave it there before the next full moon. Thomas laughed it off. He did not believe in curses or in the restless dead. He placed the chalice on the mantle beside his other finds, a Roman coin, a rusted horseshoe, a bit of old pottery. But at night, when the wind moved through the valley, he thought he heard something different in it. Not a voice, not a sound he could name, but a kind of rhythm, low, deliberate, as though the earth itself was remembering. A few days later, curiosity overcame him. He returned to the site with a lantern and began to dig again, determined to see what else lay below. The ground was colder this time, and the deeper he went, the stronger the smell of damp stone became. At last his spade hit wood, the remains of another box, smaller, locked with an iron clasp. The wood crumbled easily, and inside he found a bundle of decayed parchment bound in thread. The pages were stiff with mold, the ink nearly vanished, but when he held them up to the light, faint lines of script appeared, Latin perhaps, or something like it. He could not read it, but he felt a strange unease holding it, as though the air itself grew heavier around him. He placed the bundle in his satchel and returned home before dusk. That night, the wind rose again. The walls of his cottage creaked, and the trees outside bent under the weight of the storm. He dreamed, or thought he dreamed, of a candle burning in an open window high above a ruined hall. He woke to find the fire had gone out, though no wind had touched it. The air was cold enough to see his breath. By morning, he decided to take the relics to the parish curate in the next village. The man, older and cautious, examined them with care. He confirmed the chalice was silver, likely medieval, and the writing indeed Latin. Fragments of a psalm, he thought, or perhaps part of a funeral mass. He advised Thomas to leave both items at the church for safekeeping. The valley, he said, had been holy ground once. It would be wise to treat it as such again, Thomas agreed, though uneasily. As he walked home that afternoon, he passed the old monastery once more. The sun was low, the air thick with mist. Through the broken arches, he thought he saw a flicker of light, just for a moment, deep inside the ruins, like a candle burning in a place long abandoned. He stood watching until the mist closed over it, then he turned away, telling himself it was only the reflection of the sun. But as he walked down the slope, the sound of the wind shifted again, low, slow, almost like chanting. That night, no one in the village slept well. Dogs barked without reason. The cows grew restless in their stalls. One woman swore she saw figures moving in the fields, though when her husband went to look, there was nothing there but fog. By morning, the air in the valley felt different. The soil near the monastery, freshly turned, seemed to breathe faintly, not rising, not sinking, just pulsing in time with the slow rhythm of the wind. It was as if the earth had remembered the shape of those who once lay within it, as if the bones beneath had begun to listen again, and above them, unseen, the ivy rustled against the stones, a whisper of green against grey, steady as the turning of time. By the middle of the 19th century, the monastery, once a living body of faith, later a carcass of stone and ivy, had become a curiosity for those who sought the romance of ruin. Antiquarians, poets, and early historians, travelling the rural backroads of Britain and northern Europe, often stumbled upon forgotten abbeys lost to the ages. It was during this gentle age of rediscovery that a certain scholar, whose name would fade even from the margins of his own notes, arrived in the valley where the old monastery lay. He was not the first to come upon its remains, but he was the first to stay long enough to study them with deliberate care. Drawn by faint references in medieval charters and parish records, he followed winding lanes until the stones of the valley rose around him. The air here was noticeably different, cooler, stiller, touched by the damp scent of moss and earth. When he first saw the monastery, he described it as a skeleton in repose, yet breathing faintly through its roots and shadows. The scholar lodged in a small farmhouse a mile away, carrying each morning his tools, notebooks, and a lantern into the ruins. He spent long hours sketching the surviving arches and cataloguing the fragments of carved capitals. What remained of the cloister was uneven and overgrown, its flagstones pried apart by ivy stems. The refectory, once filled with the murmur of voices and the scraping of wooden bowls, now harboured only the cooing of doves. The scriptorium had collapsed entirely, its stones scattered and half buried under nettles. In his journal, which survives in part, he wrote extensively of the monastery's architecture. The nave was built in the late Romanesque style, with thick pillars and rounded arches bearing faint traces of paint. Later additions, pointed windows and ribbed vaults, hinted at early Gothic influences, suggesting that the abbey had expanded and evolved across several generations. The scholar recorded every visible carving, the worn image of a lamb above a doorway, the delicate knotwork along the choir stalls, and the weather-softened faces of saints whose eyes had been scratched out, perhaps during the years of dissolution. Yet, as his observations grew more detailed, so too did his tone begin to shift. The early entries are brisk, academic, and exacting. The later ones wander into the language of atmosphere and unease. He began to note small peculiarities, the way the air within the chapel felt cooler than outside, even when the sun burned bright on the valley slopes. He remarked on the sound of dripping water, though no rain had fallen. He described the faint odour of wax and smoke near the broken altar, though no candle had burned there for centuries. Most unsettling were his references to sound. In one entry, dated the evening of his second week, He wrote that while sketching the arch of the southern transept, he heard a bell. It was not the sharp metallic toll of a church nearby, but rather a low, distant note, muffled as if heard through water or earth. He paused, listened again, but the valley was silent. The villagers later assured him that no church bell had rung for miles around. He dismissed the incident as fatigue, the kind brought on by long hours and damp air. But in the following nights, the noises grew more insistent. He heard faint chanting, slow, rhythmic, in a language he could not discern. Sometimes it drifted from the direction of the old choir, sometimes from beneath the ground itself. Once he thought he saw a flicker of light, deep within the old library's broken window. Assuming it was a reflection from his own lantern, he walked closer, only to find the window dark and empty. In his notes he began to compare the monastery to a sleeping creature. He suggested that places might retain memory, that stone could somehow echo the impressions of those who had lived and died within its walls. Perhaps the air itself, he wrote, remembers the rhythm of their prayers, as water remembers the shape of a vessel long removed. It was an unorthodox idea for a man of his rational discipline, yet his writing betrayed a subtle shift from analysis to reverence, even fear. He worked there for nearly a month, methodically tracing each corner of the ruins. The villagers grew wary of him. They said he lingered too long after sunset, that he returned pale and shivering, eyes hollow from sleeplessness. One man who helped carry his instruments claimed that, upon entering the chapel, the scholar would always pause and bow his head, as though acknowledging something unseen. His last journal entry was brief and uncharacteristic. It contained no sketches, no notes on architecture, only a single line written shakily: "The bells are not gone, they ring for no living ear." When the farmer who had hosted him went to the ruins the next morning, he found the scholar's lantern still lit upon a fallen stone, the flames steady despite the wind. His books and instruments were neatly stacked beside it. There was no sign of him in the valley or beyond. The villagers searched for several days, but nothing was ever found. In the years that followed, some claimed to see a dim light moving within the ruins at dusk, and others said they heard the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the cloister. Whether he was taken by accident, madness, or something else entirely, the scholar became another layer in the monastery's long memory, one more presence added to the air of watchful quiet that hung perpetually over the stones, and so the valley returned once again to stillness. The ivy grew thicker, the seasons turned, and the written pages of the scholar's findings passed from one antiquarian hand to another, acquiring dust and myth in equal measure. Only a few of his notes survived intact, and in them, the monastery seemed to breathe, faintly alive through the weight of its own silence. By the early years of the 20th century, the ruins of the monastery had become more than a curiosity. They were a symbol of a vanished world, a tangible connection to a past that most of the valley's inhabitants only remembered through fragments of legend. Antiquarians had written about the site. Scholars had catalogued fragments of stone and manuscript, and travelers still made the journey to peer at the ivy-choked walls. Yet no one had attempted to intervene in the structure itself until a small committee of local historians, inspired by the broader restoration movement sweeping through Europe, decided that the monastery should be preserved. The effort began modestly, with careful surveys and measurements. Photographs were taken to record the state of the ruins, and drawings were made to guide the intended repairs. The valley, still thick with mist in the mornings and heavy with wild grasses, seemed at first indifferent to human interference. Birds nested in the belfry, owls slept in the arches, and the slow rhythm of moss creeping across the stones continued uninterrupted. Yet the presence of men with hammers, scaffolds and carts was enough to disturb the silence that had settled there for centuries. Scaffolding went up along the walls of the cloisters first. Timber from nearby forests was cut and hoisted, its scent of pine mixing with the damp smell of ivy and earth. Mortar was mixed in clay pits, and stones were rearranged to repair the most precarious sections. The workers moved carefully, not from reverence but from practicality. A single misstep could collapse centuries of fragile masonry. Yet despite their precautions, there was an atmosphere of unease that no practical measure could mitigate. The villagers watched from the edges of the valley. They were curious but cautious, drawn by both the promise of employment and the thrill of proximity to a place they had long been taught to regard with quiet suspicion. Some of the older villagers whispered that the monks had never truly left, that the air of the cloisters still carried the residue of prayer and devotion. Others spoke of dreams that had begun to plague anyone who spent even a few nights in the valley, visions of robed figures appearing in the windows, of shadowy hands reaching from collapsed walls, and of a candle flame that burned too steadily to be natural. Despite the careful work, progress was slow. The builders moved only on fair-weather days, often halted by rain that turned the valley floor to clay, or by frost that made the stone slick and dangerous. Even on sunny days, the scaffolds groaned in protest, and the timbers seemed to creak with voices that were not entirely mechanical. The foreman dismissed such murmurs as imagination, yet he too could not deny the sense of being observed, the persistent feeling that eyes followed every motion along the ruined corridors. When night fell, the valley grew particularly still. The restored portions of wall seemed to absorb moonlight differently than the untouched stone, creating a patchwork of shadow and pale illumination. Workers returning to their tents reported hearing faint chanting drifting through the scaffolds, monotone, low, indistinct, as though carried on a wind that existed only within the ruins. Lamps flickered, despite calm air, and tools left leaning against the walls sometimes fell overnight, though no one could account for the disturbance. As the weeks passed, funding became an issue. The committee responsible for the restoration had overestimated the costs and underestimated the difficulty of working in such a remote location. Materials could not always be transported, and laborers were frequently reassigned to more pressing projects elsewhere. Eventually, the effort stalled altogether. Scaffolds remained half erected, planks and bricks abandoned where they stood, mortar dried unfinished in trays, rust forming on hammers and chisels left leaning against walls. In the aftermath, the monastery took on a strange new aspect. The scaffolds, once symbols of human intent and intervention, became part of the ruin itself. Ivy began climbing the wood as eagerly as it had climbed the stones, draping the unfinished construction in green filigree. The tools and bricks, long forgotten, seemed to settle into the ground as though the earth had accepted them as part of its own memory. The valley returned to its previous rhythm, though now there were new layers to the silence. The soft creak of weathered scaffolding, the faint clatter of loose tools shifting in the wind, and the occasional whisper that travelers insisted they could hear in the cloisters. Locals began to tell stories about the restoration, embellishing the facts with every retelling. They said that anyone who attempted to rebuild the monastery was troubled in dreams. Men who worked a single day in the ruins would awaken to see shadowy figures at the edges of their vision, cloaked and moving in silence. Some reported waking to the scent of incense, the faint scrape of quills, and the unmistakable warmth of candlelight in rooms that had no source for flame. Mothers told their children never to linger near the valley after dark, insisting that the monks still watched, that the spirits of prayer and discipline had not yet surrendered the walls to human hands. Even those who had little faith themselves found it difficult to ignore the atmosphere. Travelers passing the valley noted how the ruined walls seemed to shift subtly in the moonlight, how scaffolds that had stood for decades appeared newly moved in the mornings, or how the ivy seemed to advance at an unnatural speed. Folklorists of the period, eager to document rural superstitions, recorded the story in pamphlets and periodicals. The abandoned restoration of the monastery, they titled it, noting that all efforts to repair the site had failed, leaving the ruins frozen in a perpetual state of incomplete preservation. The valley once again reclaimed the structure. Ivy and moss enveloped the scaffolds, the tools rusted through, and the unfinished masonry crumbled. But the air retained a different kind of weight after the restoration attempt, an almost tangible sense of expectation. Visitors swore that they could hear the sound of distant chanting more clearly after the scaffolds went up, as though the partially repaired walls had awakened some latent memory of the monks who had once prayed there. By the mid-20th century, the unfinished restoration had become part of the legend itself. The monastery was no longer just a ruin, it was a ruin that had resisted human intervention, a place that would neither fully decay nor be wholly repaired. Scholars visiting the valley recorded the abandoned scaffolds, the ivy-covered tools, and the rusted metal as evidence of failed ambition. Tourists, however, were drawn less by architectural curiosity than by the stories whispered by the local villagers of monks whose presence lingered in shadow, of dreams that invaded the minds of the unwary, and of the valley that refused to surrender its secrets. And so the monastery remained, unchanged by human hands. Its walls, half restored, half ruined, were cloaked in ivy. The wind passed through scaffolds that had long ceased to serve any purpose but to hold the echoes of effort. Tools lay rusting on the stone floors, abandoned hammers and chisels forming a silent chorus with the fallen leaves and creeping moss. Above it all, the ghosts of centuries seemed to watch patiently, their vigil uninterrupted. The restoration, never finished, became part of the monastery's history, a testament not to human determination but to endurance and the slow, inexorable reclamation of the valley by stone, ivy, and wind. Visitors in later decades would speak of the ruins with awe and unease, describing the sense of being observed, the faint sounds that could not be explained, and the compelling impression that those who had once lived and prayed there had not entirely departed. The monastery existed now in three states simultaneously: past, ruin, and memory. The scaffolds were ghosts in themselves, haunting the ivy-wrapped walls, markers of ambition undone. The earth beneath the stone seemed to pulse with the rhythm of centuries, and the air carried, faintly but unmistakably, the weight of prayers long since ended, the soft echo of chanting, and the persistent sense of eyes watching from shadowed corners. By the early 1940s, the valley that had long remained a silent witness to centuries of history found itself drawn into the convulsions of a world at war. The old monastery, half swallowed by ivy and moss, with scaffolds long abandoned and tools rusted into their positions, stood as it always had, a ruin yet not entirely lifeless. Its walls, crumbling yet resilient, offered shelter not only from wind and rain, but from a human world that had become frighteningly unpredictable. The war brought with it an influx of people displaced by conflict, refugees from bombed cities, families uprooted from rural towns near the coasts, and occasionally soldiers on leave or retreat. They arrived by foot or by commandeered vehicles, carrying what they could hold, moving quietly through the valley under the cautious light of dawn. For them, the monastery represented sanctuary, however imperfect. It was a roofless chapel in parts, a series of half-standing cloisters in others, yet it offered walls against wind and rain, corridors for privacy, and spaces for temporary encampments. Inside the ruins, the atmosphere was strange, but oddly comforting. The ivy-draped walls muffled sound, and created a private world apart from the chaos outside. Fires were lit in safe corners, often in former hearths or beneath the sheltering arches of the refectory. Refugees carefully avoided damaging the older structures, aware, at least subconsciously, of the centuries of history they inhabited. Children played quietly among the ruins, following the worn lines of stones and tracing the faded inscriptions on capitals, as if learning a forgotten language of stone. Even in the mundane rhythm of daily survival, there were interruptions of the uncanny. Many of those who stayed reported faint, inexplicable phenomena. Soldiers who slept in the former dormitory claimed to hear footsteps above them at night, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern across floors that had long since collapsed. Women cooking in the refectory swore that the faint scent of incense would sometimes drift down corridors, though no one had burned anything, and no religious service had been performed. The smell was not unpleasant. In fact, it was often described as calming, a reminder of a distant, disciplined life of prayer, of long-ago devotion. One older refugee, who had been a parish priest before the war, told stories to the younger arrivals of the monks who had once inhabited the monastery. He spoke quietly, not of ghosts or malevolent spirits, but of the quiet vigilance of centuries, of men who had lived and prayed within these walls, and who, he believed, still lingered to watch over those seeking shelter. He suggested that the monastery itself remembered, that it had a kind of memory embedded in its stone and ivy, and that this memory sometimes manifested as the soft echoes and smells that the newcomers were experiencing. The soldiers, practical and skeptical by nature, initially laughed at such tales, but even they could not deny the experiences they had. One man, billeted in the ruins for several nights during a particularly harsh winter, reported waking to see a figure kneeling in the chapel doorway, robed and silent. When he blinked or rose to approach, it was gone. Others, who took watch on the battlements that remained standing in the collapsed belfry, swore they heard chanting carried on the wind, low and measured, repeating in patterns that were impossible to reproduce naturally. The monastery, in this period, became more than a refuge of stone and shelter. It was a locus of quiet comfort, a space where human lives intersected with centuries of memory and history. Its presence seemed to impart a rhythm to the days, a pacing that existed apart from wartime urgency. Children learned the layout of the ruin, as if it were a secret garden. Adults felt a subtle easing of tension while walking through the cloisters. Even when fires were built to cook meals or boil water, care was taken to avoid any unnecessary damage, reinforcing the implicit sense that the monastery was a living entity, deserving of respect even in its ruin. Throughout these years, the physical structure continued to change. The scaffolds left from the early 20th century restoration had long since rotted away, but new damage appeared from weather, the weight of snow, and the occasional hasty construction of makeshift shelters. Still, the monastery endured. Stone walls that had once framed silent monks now framed families and soldiers, and the echo of past life seemed to mingle seamlessly with the present. Every creak of timber, every distant flutter of birds in the belfry, seemed to take on significance, as though the ruins were observing, cataloguing, and integrating each new visitor into the ongoing memory of the valley. Among the refugees, some began keeping small journals, noting their experiences in the ruins. They wrote not of fear, but of the unusual serenity, punctuated by the inexplicable, a brief reflection of candlelight in an empty window, the sound of a door creaking on hinges long removed, the pattern of shadows across walls in the moonlight. One diary described the chapel as a space that, while roofless, felt enclosed and protective, and noted the persistence of what the writer called the quiet music of centuries. The monastery also became a meeting place for quiet human kindness. Neighbors brought food for those who had arrived with little. People cleaned sections of the floor, swept the broken tiles, and repaired small portions of walls just enough to prevent complete collapse. This act of care, though modest, seemed to reinforce the monastery's long-standing relationship with those who sought refuge within its stones. A place that had once nurtured spiritual life now nurtured survival and community in a more practical sense. As the war progressed, the valley experienced occasional nearby bombardments, the sound of distant explosions rolling over the hills. Yet the monastery remained largely untouched, though the earth around it shook and dust sometimes fell from weakened arches. Those who stayed within its walls reported a sense of protection, a quiet belief that the monastery itself, steeped in centuries of presence and prayer, shielded them from harm. In letters sent home, refugees and soldiers alike described the valley as strangely calm, a place where even in wartime the normal rhythms of wind, rain and birdsong seemed to continue without interruption. By the end of the war, the monastery had once again proven itself resilient. It had survived the centuries of neglect, the failed restoration, and now the pressures of human conflict. The people who left the valley at the war's conclusion carried with them memories of refuge, of strange comfort, and of sensations that could not easily be explained. The faint smells of incense, the echoing footsteps on upper floors, the sense of presence that lingered in shadowed corridors. These memories became stories told quietly around hearths, passed from one generation to the next, contributing to the monastery's growing legend. Even after the last refugees departed, the valley remained altered by human presence. Scorched patches of grass marked the sites of temporary fires, flattened earth showed where tents had been pitched, and small unnoticed alterations to the stonework were made in haste. Yet, in the quiet that returned once all had left, the monastery resumed its slow, deliberate rhythm. Moss grew over newly trodden paths, ivy crept over exposed wood and stone, and the wind resumed its habitual murmur through empty corridors. The monastery, in its wartime role, had reasserted itself as a sanctuary for the lost and the displaced, just as it had done centuries earlier during plague and famine. It had become a place where human need intersected with the enduring presence of history, and where the echoes of faith, labor, and quiet ritual continued to linger, subtle and persistent in the air and stones. And once again, after the last visitors had gone, the valley fell silent, carrying the monastery's long memory with it, a space that held refuge, mystery, and the faintest hints of devotion, uninterrupted by time or circumstance. In the decades following the Second World War, the monastery settled once more into its familiar rhythm of abandonment. Nature reclaimed each corner that human hands had temporarily disturbed. Ivy thickened its embrace around fallen stones, moss filled the spaces between the flagstones, and small animals nested quietly among the remnants of the old cloisters. The valley itself seemed to sigh under the weight of history, carrying with it the subtle residue of centuries, prayer, toil, despair, and now, survival. Yet the monastery never entirely disappeared from human consciousness. Stories lingered in village parlors, passed down through generations, merging with fragments of fact and embroidered with the vividness of memory. It was in this climate of whispered recollection and partially recorded history that a modern historian, Dr. Eleanor Hartley, arrived in the valley. Unlike the antiquarian scholars of the 19th century, Hartley approached the site with the dual lenses of anthropology and historiography. She was interested not only in the physical ruins, nor only in what written documents might reveal, but in the layered ways in which memory, legend, and material history intersected in a single space. Her project was meticulous. She would collect oral histories from local villagers, examine surviving archival documents in nearby towns, and attempt to reconcile these stories with the physical evidence that remained in the monastery itself. Dr. Hartley's days began at first light. She walked the valley slowly, notebook in hand, measuring distances between surviving walls and sketching the faint traces of the cloister arches. Each stone bore a story, sometimes literal, carved in Latin, sometimes more subtle, a scar from centuries of weather, fire, or human touch. She would pause often, leaning on her staff, listening to the whisper of wind through ivy, letting the rhythm of the valley seep into her consciousness. She found that her own breath slowed as she moved through the cloisters, aligning with a cadence that had persisted long before her arrival. Her evenings were spent in conversation with the villagers, many of whom had family histories entwined with the monastery. Some had ancestors who had sought refuge there during wartime. Others spoke of tales passed down of monks who had lingered in shadowed corridors, of candles that burned in empty windows, and of footsteps echoing across floors that no longer existed. Hartley recorded each story with care, noting the variations, the embellishments, and the small consistencies that suggested kernels of truth. She discovered, for instance, that several accounts mentioned a faint smell of incense, even when no living soul had burned anything. The same was said of distant slow tolling, a sound some claimed carried across the valley on misty nights. Archival research supplemented these oral accounts. In local parishes, Hartley found ledgers from the 18th century detailing sporadic visits to the monastery, letters describing the discovery of buried relics, and sketches of the ruin during early restoration attempts. She cross-referenced these documents with newspaper articles from the 19th and 20th centuries, recording incidents of wandering soldiers, displaced families, and antiquarian visits. Each fragment added a layer, a palimpsest of human interaction with the site over nearly a millennium. The historian was particularly interested in the interplay of erasure and preservation. The monastery had been dissolved in the 16th century, its monks dispersed, its walls left to decay. The early restoration attempt in the 20th century had failed, leaving scaffolds and tools to rust. The valley had witnessed fire, flood, famine, and war, yet the essence of the monastery remained. Its memory persisted in the air, in the stones, and in the collective consciousness of those who lived nearby. Hartley wrote extensively about how physical ruins act as vessels for memory, preserving echoes of past lives, while also allowing for new stories to form. Nightfall in the valley brought a different kind of research. Hartley often stayed in a small cottage near the ruins, venturing out in lantern light to observe the site after dark. She recorded the sounds, the movement of shadows, and the behavior of local wildlife, taking care to note phenomena that might later be interpreted as hauntings or other supernatural occurrences. She approached these with analytical rigor, yet she also allowed herself to consider the possibility that memory and perception could overlap with the material reality of the monastery. The faint sound of wind through collapsed arches could be described in mechanical terms, yet it also felt imbued with the weight of centuries of prayer and human life. Throughout her work, Hartley reflected on the human impulse to preserve and interpret history. She noted that while written documents might disappear, oral traditions persist. While walls crumble, stories continue to shape the imagination of those who encounter them. She catalogued these layers meticulously, creating a comprehensive record that blended archival rigor with ethnographic sensitivity. The historian recognized that the monastery, in its quiet persistence, offered lessons about continuity and impermanence, about how time simultaneously erases and preserves. Her field notes frequently paused to describe the sensory experience of being within the ruins, the chill in the early morning air that seemed heavier in the nave, the way moss softened the impact of each footstep, the whisper of ivy brushing against stones in the wind, the subtle, persistent echo of birdsong across the arches, almost like music remembered rather than created. In these passages, she sought to convey the atmospheric reality of the monastery, not merely its history and dates and events. Hartley's research also led her to reflect on the interdependence of human and non-human history. The valley, with its persistent mist and slowly eroding hills, had shaped and been shaped by the monastery. Trees that grew up alongside collapsed walls had been planted intentionally in some periods, accidentally in others. Moss, lichen, and ivy gradually reclaimed stonework, integrating human construction into natural cycles. Even as human history ebbed and flowed around the ruins, the site maintained a continuity of presence, a persistent thread connecting centuries of occupation, neglect, and observation. By the conclusion of her research, Dr. Hartley had produced a body of work that was at once analytical and reflective. She argued that the monastery existed not only in historical fact, but also in collective memory, that the whispers of villagers, the accounts of wartime shelter, the stories of scholars lost or intrigued, and even the faint traces of footsteps and incense in the air, all contributed to a living archive. History, she wrote, was not only about what could be documented on paper, but also about the impressions, the sensations, and the echoes that survive in the spaces between fact and memory. The historian's work drew attention to a subtle truth. The monastery was a vessel for time itself. In its ruins, one could trace the sequence of decades, centuries, and human events, yet the valley's silence and solitude preserved them not as rigid records, but as impressions, accessible to those who could slow their own pace and listen carefully. Each visitor, scholar, or wandering traveler added their own layer to this accumulated memory, whether consciously or unconsciously, weaving the monastery into the ongoing story of human experience. And so, the valley and its monastery continued to exist in multiple forms simultaneously, as ruins of stone and ivy, as historical artifacts catalogued and interpreted by scholars, and as a repository of memory, myth, and lived experience. Dr. Hartley's work ensured that the intangible elements, the whispers, the faint sense, the perceived presence of unseen monks were recorded with the same diligence as physical fragments. She recognized that these elements were not merely superstition, but essential components of understanding a site that had survived centuries of human action, neglect, and natural reclamation. The historian departed the valley in late autumn, leaving behind notebooks filled with sketches, transcriptions, and reflections. The monastery returned to its usual quiet, but it carried the traces of her visit, a few misplaced footprints in moss, faint pencil marks on fallen stones, and the subtle weight of attention added to centuries of observation. The site, always layered with memory and time, now included yet another witness. Even in her absence, her research shaped the valley's story. Scholars, villagers, and travelers who later consulted her work learned of the ways in which the monastery's history was preserved, not only in manuscripts or bricks, but in the persistent echoes of human presence, in the rhythm of silence, and in the patient accumulation of centuries of observation. The monastery, as always, endured. It existed in the intersection of memory and time, holding the traces of all who had passed through, sheltered, studied, or simply observed. And in doing so, it became something more than a ruin, a living archive, where history and human consciousness intertwined in the faintest of echoes. As winter approached, Dr. Eleanor Hartley returned to the monastery for a final series of observations, intending to experience the site not only in daylight, but through the long stretch of night. The solstice had been approaching for several weeks, and the valley, blanketed with early frost and low-hanging mists, seemed to signal that the year was nearing its quietest, most introspective point. Trees stripped bare of leaves allowed the pale moonlight to spill uninterrupted across the broken stones, and every path, every archway, carried a chill that suggested both absence and anticipation. Hartley had arranged to stay in what remained of the guest house, a small stone structure at the edge of the cloister. She arrived in late afternoon, the valley hushed beneath a veil of fog, and immediately noticed how the monastery absorbed sound differently in winter. Her footsteps, though careful on frost-hardened ground, seemed muted, swallowed by moss and stone. Birds were sparse, and the occasional crow, distant and solitary, seemed to accentuate the pervasive quiet rather than break it. She placed her journal, lantern, and modest supplies on the table in the guest house, and moved slowly through the cloisters before the last light faded. The evening settled in gradually. She noted how the air thickened as the temperature dropped, forming tiny clouds of breath with each exhalation. The ruins themselves appeared to settle, the frost shimmering on the ivy and moss-covered stones, as if the monastery were exhaling. The wind, when it moved, whispered through the empty windows and collapsed arches, creating patterns of sound that were at once natural and curiously suggestive, like echoes of long-forgotten footsteps. Hartley wrote in her journal, December 21st, "The valley is silent, yet intensely aware. Each archway frames nothing and everything at once. Shadows pool in the corners, and the stone feels heavier than air." As darkness fully descended, she lit a small lantern, placing it carefully on a stone ledge near the former entrance to the refectory. The warm glow contrasted sharply with the cold tones of moonlight, illuminating a few scattered tiles and fragments of carved capitals. She walked through the cloisters again, noting how shadows fell differently under the pale silvery light. The ruins seemed transformed at night. Small details became emphasized, textures more pronounced, and empty spaces suggested subtle movements where there were none. Around midnight, subtle phenomena began to emerge, though nothing overtly supernatural occurred. Hartley, accustomed to careful observation, recorded each sound and movement with precision. There was a creak of wood somewhere above the guest house, likely a remnant of the half-abandoned scaffolding from the previous century, but it seemed to repeat in a deliberate rhythm. A faint thud echoed across the refectory floor, consistent enough to suggest footsteps, yet inconsistent with the rhythm or size of her own. Sometimes the sound seemed to come from above, other times from the far end of the cloisters. Most remarkable was a pattern of sound that she later described as distant chanting. It was slow, low, almost subliminal, threading through the ruins in intervals. No words could be made out, and the tone was more harmonic than language. a series of resonances that seemed tied to the architecture itself. It rose and fell like the sway of breath, at once foreign and familiar. Hartley speculated that the wind, moving through specific corridors and hollow spaces, might have created a natural echo chamber, yet she recorded it in her journal without forcing a conclusion. The historian noted how these subtle sensations affected perception. Shadows seemed to lengthen and contract, corners of rooms appeared to hold depth where none existed, and the cold stone walls felt almost animate under the lantern's glow. She observed the patterns of frost on fallen tiles, and the way the ivy pressed against collapsed walls, moving imperceptibly in the wind. Even the faint odor of damp earth seemed layered with something more elusive, a memory of smoke, of candle wax, of centuries of devotion. Hartley spent much of the night moving slowly through the monastery, pausing in the chapel and the refectory, leaning against the cold stone of the cloisters, and noting the interplay between material decay and the persistence of memory. She reflected that the ruins themselves seemed to hold a record of every human presence, the monks who had lived, prayed, and died here, the scholar who disappeared, the soldiers and refugees, and now herself. Each layer of history contributed subtly to the atmosphere, a quiet accumulation of presence rather than dramatic haunting. Around 2 in the morning, she paused in the former scriptorium. The lantern's light fell across broken stones and partially exposed flooring. The wind shifted, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible note of sound like the scraping of a quill on parchment. Hartley did not move closer. She simply observed, recording the experience. She speculated that it might be structural, a loose fragment of wood or stone, but the quality of the sound, intermittent and carefully modulated, suggested something else entirely, something tied to memory and perception rather than physical causation. The remainder of the night passed with small repeated phenomena, faint footsteps, subtle creaks, occasional wind patterns that mimicked chanting or singing. There was no figure, no direct apparition, only the sense that the monastery retained traces of human activity in its spatial memory. Hartley described this in her journal as a layering of time, where each presence leaves a faint impression perceptible only to those who pause long enough to notice. By dawn, the valley remained still and frost-laden. The mist had deepened overnight, curling around the cloisters and cloaking the ruins in pale grey. Hartley walked the grounds slowly, taking in the frozen shapes of walls, the interplay of shadow and frost, and the subtle sounds of the natural world resuming activity, birds beginning their morning calls, the rustle of small mammals in undergrowth, the faint trickle of meltwater. She noted how the ruins absorbed and filtered these sounds, creating a quiet symphony that felt at once natural and historically resonant. Her reflections on the winter solstice night remained among her most detailed accounts of the monastery. She concluded that the site offered a unique intersection of perception, memory, and history. Human presence was encoded in stone, wood, and ivy. Wind and frost revealed these presences in subtle patterns, and the silence of the valley acted as a canvas for centuries of layered experience. There was no horror, no terror, only a profound quiet unease born of awareness, the sense that the monastery was alive in its memory, and that those who entered it, even briefly, became part of the ongoing record of the place. Hartley left the ruins just after sunrise, her notebook filled with descriptions of sound, sensation, and perception, alongside sketches and maps of the nocturnal conditions. The valley resumed its customary quiet after her departure, but the monastery's subtle activity remained, as if acknowledging that one more layer of observation had been added to its long history. For the historian, and for anyone who would follow, the night of the winter solstice offered proof that time, memory, and place are intertwined, and that some spaces hold the echoes of human life in ways that are perceptible only to those willing to remain, silent and patient, long enough to listen. The valley at dawn held a fragile quiet, the kind of stillness that seems to linger just beyond perception, where the air itself feels heavy with memory. Dr. Eleanor Hartley remained awake in the ruins of the monastery after the long winter night, her notebook and lantern at her side, having spent hours moving through corridors and cloisters, while the mist curled around fallen stones and ivy-clad arches. As the first hints of light filtered through the broken windows of the chapel, the landscape was muted and indistinct, pale grey blending into pale green, frost into moss, stone into shadow. It was in this liminal hour, that slender space between night and day, that Hartley experienced something that defied explanation, an occurrence that would later occupy her thoughts and writings more persistently than any archival discovery. She had ventured into the central cloister to take final measurements, tracing the outlines of collapsed walls and noting the alignment of fallen flagstones. The mist that had settled overnight clung to the ground, curling around her feet and rising in delicate tendrils from the earth. The air was still, yet it seemed pregnant with subtle movement, the whisper of wind through ivy, the rustle of small animals among debris, the occasional tap of a loose stone settling under frost. Hartley paused frequently, lowering her lantern to the floor and squinting through the mist, noting each faint irregularity. The ruins, she observed, possessed a persistent capacity to transform, to carry the observer into a space where time's boundaries felt suspended. It was then, in that muted, half-light moment, that she saw them. They appeared first as elongated shapes in the mist, shadows that seemed to detach from the broken walls. At first she assumed it was a trick of perspective, an optical illusion born of fatigue and the uneven light. But as she blinked and adjusted her stance, the forms solidified, a procession of figures moving silently across the cloister floor. They were hooded, robes long and flowing, their movements deliberate and calm, unhurried. Their pace did not quicken or falter, it was measured, rhythmical, as if following a choreography known only to themselves. The historian's immediate response was analytical. She searched for any rational explanation. Perhaps workers from nearby farms had entered the ruins early, or some wind-blown cloak or tarp had caught the shape of stone in the mist. Yet the figures exhibited cohesion, a unity of motion that made such explanations implausible. They moved not randomly, but in loose formation, weaving through arches, around collapsed pillars, and past walls that had no doorway or passage to guide them. No sound accompanied their steps, not even the scrape of cloth against stone. Hartley, accustomed to cataloguing anomalies, made careful notes: the order of the figures, the subtle variations in robe length, the angles at which hoods tilted over faces, and the arc of their movement through space. Their faces, when glimpsed, were unreadable. The hoods cast shadows so deep that no features could be distinguished. At times Hartley felt as though she could perceive only a suggestion of eyes, dim and observing, but never active, never reactive. They did not look at her, their procession seemed indifferent to her presence, moving with a calm that was neither threatening nor welcoming. There was no emotion in their motion, only persistence, as though the passage of centuries had imprinted on them a single, continuous purpose. Hartley observed with the detached fascination of a historian that the figures seemed tethered to the cloister itself. As they moved, their steps corresponded to the rhythm of the arches and pillars, each shadow falling in precise alignment with architectural features. She noted the spatial symmetry, the way the mist enveloped and refracted the forms, creating the illusion of multiplicity, sometimes two figures, sometimes three, sometimes extending to a dozen, yet always within the bounds of the cloister, and always fading at the edges where morning light began to dissolve the mist. The vision did not linger indefinitely. Gradually, as pale light strengthened, the figures began to thin at the edges, their outlines blurring, their robes dissolving into the rising mist. By the time the sun had crested the distant hills, the cloister was empty, and only the subtle traces of frost and dew remained. Hartley remained still for several minutes, notebook in hand, noting the effect of the dissolving vision, the way that light seemed to erase both shape and memory simultaneously. She wrote, "The procession receded with the mist. There was no sudden disappearance, only a gradual unraveling, a soft withdrawal into absence, and yet the space feels altered, as though the passage of something not entirely corporeal, has been recorded in the stone itself." Her rational mind sought explanations, as any historian would: fatigue, optical illusion, residual mist patterns, shifting shadows of ivy, or the subtle play of moonlight lingering in early dawn were all considered. Yet the precision, cohesion, and quiet dignity of the figures resisted such reduction. Hartley allowed herself the rare acknowledgement that not all phenomena are readily explained, and that in certain spaces human perception may intersect with echoes of the past in ways that resist conventional analysis. In her subsequent reflections, Hartley connected this vision to other aspects of the monastery's long history. The ruined cloister had been witness to centuries of monastic ritual, from the disciplined routines of prayer and manuscript, copying to the quiet endurance of plague and famine. Each layer of human activity left an imprint, whether through architecture, memory, or the residue of presence embedded in the stones. The procession, she hypothesized, might be the imprint of countless monks passing through the cloisters in life, preserved in some subtle form by the material and atmospheric conditions of the valley. She wrote extensively on the intersection of memory and perception, suggesting that spaces like the monastery accumulate traces of human action in ways that are persistent but not fully comprehensible. These traces, when encountered under specific environmental conditions, mist, early light, quiet, and attentiveness, can manifest as phenomena that appear vividly to observers. The vision of the hooded figures was, in her assessment, less a haunting and more an encounter with accumulated memory made perceptible in a liminal moment. After the vision faded, Hartley spent the remainder of the morning walking through the cloisters, noting the residual sensations, the subtle shifting of air, the faint echo of footsteps in empty corridors, the almost imperceptible warmth of the stone where the procession had passed. She recorded these details meticulously, aware that for future researchers they might provide insight into the ways that human perception intersects with the layered history of a site. By the time she left the valley, the mist had lifted entirely, revealing the monastery in full morning light. The ruins appeared as they had for centuries, silent, half overgrown, and deeply evocative. Yet Hartley carried with her a sense that the cloisters had been alive in a different sense that day, animated not by the present, but by the accumulation of centuries, memory, and human presence. She recorded the cloister holds its own record. It is written not in ink, but in shadow, movement, and stillness. The vision is gone, but the stone retains its imprint. Thus the monastery continued its layered existence, a site where past and present intersect, where memory and perception intertwine, and where even in absence, the echoes of human life and ritual remain perceptible to those who pause, watch, and listen. Years passed after Dr. Eleanor Hartley's extended stays in the valley, and the monastery had settled once more into its slow, deliberate rhythm of ruin and quiet. Time, as it had for centuries, moved across the stones and moss with patient persistence, erasing little yet softening the sharp edges of human intervention. The ivy thickened, filling gaps in crumbling walls, and the faint pathways of worn flagstones, once trodden by monks and later by soldiers and refugees, became less defined, smoothed by frost, rain, and neglect. The valley's mists continued to drift along its undulating contours, curling around ivy-laden arches and collapsing buttresses, lending a sense of perpetual liminality to the scene, neither fully present in the past, nor entirely of the present. Hartley, in her later reflections, considered the monastery not as a static artifact, but as an ongoing record of human presence. She thought about the procession of hooded figures she had witnessed during the solstice night, and the faint chanting that seemed to thread through the cloisters in the early hours. Her rational mind had sought explanations, optical illusions, shifting mists, acoustical phenomena caused by arches. But even now, years later, she could not dismiss entirely the sense that some element of the monastery's history, its very memory, had manifested in those moments. It was not a ghost in the conventional sense, nor a supernatural event. It was the residue of centuries of devotion, labor, and human presence made perceptible under extraordinary conditions. The historian's notebooks from that visit had grown into a substantial archive. They included careful measurements of the ruins, sketches of arches, columns and windows, and detailed annotations of the environmental conditions during her observations. Beyond this, she had recorded oral histories from villagers, legends that described a candle eternally burning in the library window, a procession of silent monks, and faint chanting at dusk and dawn. To Hartley, these were not merely tales of superstition, but evidence of the way human memory and imagination coalesce around particular places, leaving impressions that persist long after the events themselves. In her reflective essays, Hartley wrote about the ways in which spaces such as the monastery encode memory. She suggested that ruins are not inert. They are repositories for time, holding the echoes of every life, every footstep, every ritual that took place within them. The monastery was a prime example of this phenomenon. Its stones bore the weight of centuries, not merely in physical terms, but in experiential ones. Each visitor, monk, scholar, refugee, or historian added a layer to this accumulation. Even when abandoned, the monastery remained alive, in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. The historian revisited the valley intermittently, each visit reinforcing her observations. She noted that certain conditions, winter mist, early dawn, the half-light before sunrise, tended to evoke the strongest sense of residual presence. She described these conditions meticulously in her writing: the manner in which fog clung to the stone, the way frost refracted light across uneven surfaces, and the soft intermittent creaks that arose as timber contracted and expanded. Under these circumstances, human perception seemed to intersect with the history embedded in the monastery, producing experiences that could not be wholly explained by material reality alone. Hartley also reflected on the psychological dimension of these experiences. Long-term exposure to isolated, historically charged sites often encourages heightened sensitivity to sound, light, and movement. The faint footsteps and chanting she had perceived might have been amplified by expectation and attentiveness, yet they were anchored in the material reality of the ruins. The corridors, arches, and windows acted as acoustic and visual conduits, shaping perception in ways that could generate patterns consistent with human memory. She noted in her journals that the line between imagination and observation is not always distinct in such contexts, and that both contribute to the ongoing story of a place. Beyond her own experiences, Hartley considered the monastery's persistent influence on local culture and folklore. Villagers continued to tell tales of lights seen in the library window, of candles burning where no flame had been placed, and of quiet footsteps echoing in empty corridors. Farmers and shepherds passing through the valley would occasionally pause to glance at the ruins, reporting a sense of being watched or of a presence that was intangible yet real. Hartley interpreted these accounts as part of the layered historical narrative. Each individual's perception becomes part of the broader memory of the site, reinforcing and perpetuating its enigmatic qualities. In her essays, Hartley often wrote about the metaphysical implications of such spaces. The monastery, though physically dilapidated, remained a locus where past and present converged. The echoes she experienced, and those reported by villagers over the centuries, were not evidence of spectral beings in the supernatural sense, but rather manifestations of temporal continuity. In other words, the monastery preserved the traces of human activity and consciousness in a form that could occasionally become perceptible, especially to attentive observers. She also examined the role of the imagination in sustaining the monastery's presence. Stories of candles, silent monks, and processions are not merely embellishments, they are interpretive acts that maintain the life of the place across generations. They allow each new visitor to engage with centuries of memory, providing continuity where physical preservation may fail. In this way, legend and fact exist symbiotically, each enhancing the other. The candle burning in the library window, seen across decades, served as both symbol and record, a visible manifestation of memory embedded in architecture and consciousness. Hartley's reflections extended to the sensory qualities of the ruins themselves. The cold stone transmitted the chill of centuries, the moss softened footsteps while muffling sound, the ivy filtered light and shadow in subtle patterns. These elements created a perceptual environment in which memory and presence could converge. In her writings, she suggested that this combination of physical and psychological conditions produces an ongoing resonance. The monastery is never truly empty because it retains the imprint of every human presence, every act of devotion, work, observation, and attention. By the end of her final visit, Hartley concluded that the monastery's quiet life was not one of activity in the conventional sense, but a persistent echo of human existence. It was a site where time accumulated, where memory and material intersected, and where perception could momentarily transform history into something palpable. In her journal, she summarized: "The monastery remains deserted, yet always quietly alive. It is neither haunted nor inert. It is a repository of echoes, carrying forward the rhythm of lives long past, and offering to those who listen the faintest awareness of their presence." The valley around the ruins continued its natural cycles. Wind, frost, rain, and sun moved in patterns both predictable and irregular. Wildlife returned to the quiet spaces, nesting in collapsed walls and belfries, and within the monastery itself, the echoes persisted: the faint sound of steps across worn flagstones, the whisper of wind through ivy, the memory of chanting and candlelight, all layered upon the stone as if recorded in some subtle, imperceptible way. Even without human presence, the monastery maintained its layered existence. Visitors who approached the ruins felt its weight, sensed its quiet intensity, and left with impressions that could not be reduced to mere structural decay. It existed simultaneously as a historical artifact, a natural environment, and a vessel of memory. Hartley's work ensured that these elements were documented, that the echoes were acknowledged, and that the subtle life of the monastery could continue to be appreciated in both scholarly and personal terms. Ultimately, the monastery's enduring presence demonstrated the interplay of time, memory, and perception. It showed how a place can remain alive in absence, how the echoes of human experience persist long after the individuals themselves have vanished, and how the imagination and attentiveness of subsequent generations sustain that presence. In this way, the monastery remained more than a ruin. It was a living chronicle, a space where the past quietly whispered, carrying forward the legacy of lives that had once moved, labored, and prayed within its stone walls. As night descended over the valley for what seemed like the 1000th time in its measured, unhurried history, the monastery stood in quiet repose, its stones cooled by the absence of sun and softened by centuries of wind, frost, and rainfall. Moonlight, pale and silver, spilled across the arches and fallen columns, washing the ruins in a light that seemed simultaneously ethereal and weighty, revealing the textures of stone, moss, and ivy in stark relief while concealing what had long disappeared. In this illumination, each surface carried a memory, each shadow a hint of motion from ages past, yet all remained subtle, quiet, and unobtrusive. The valley itself seemed to exhale, a slow, rhythmic pulse that mirrored the imperceptible breathing of the earth, of time itself, as if the landscape were conscious of its own enduring history. The arches of the cloister, partially intact, caught the moonlight at angles that emphasized both their enduring structure and their inevitable fragility. Mortar had crumbled, and in some places the carved stone had been worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, yet the forms retained the grace of their original design. Here one could trace the traces of monastic devotion, the passageways trodden by hundreds of feet over centuries, the impressions of columns that had borne the weight of robed figures, the subtle patterns of shadow that echoed the order and rhythm of lives spent in prayer. Even the air seemed imbued with the lingering weight of centuries of repetition, chants whispered long ago, the scrape of quills across vellum, the soft rustle of robes as monks moved in silent procession. The moonlight illuminated the ivy climbing along fallen walls, revealing how nature had integrated itself with the remnants of human construction. Each tendril, each leaf, traced the contours of walls that had once enclosed the labor, devotion and solitude of generations. Small animals scuttled quietly, and the wind stirred the ivy and moss in gentle waves, producing a subtle, almost imperceptible rustle that seemed in conversation with the faint echoes of the monastery's past. The valley, too, seemed to participate in this nocturnal meditation, the gentle undulations of hills, the soft murmur of distant streams, the whisper of wind over frozen grasses, all contributed to a sense of continuity, a rhythm that existed independent of human attention yet intertwined with it when observed. In this liminal hour, one could sense how impermanence and persistence coexisted. The monastery, though ruined, remained present. Though abandoned, it was never absent. Stone and ivy, arch and corridor retained the memory of human touch, of ritual, of labor and loss. The dissolution of centuries, the plagues, the wars, the dispersal of monks, the collapse of roof and wall did not erase these imprints. Instead, absence created a different kind of presence, subtle, layered, and perceptible only to those patient enough to attune themselves to the rhythms of the place. Moonlight traced the contours of what had been the library, the scriptorium, and the chapel, revealing fragments of carved capitals, worn floor tiles, and remnants of vaulted arches. The faint suggestion of the eternal candle, the centuries-old legend of illumination beyond death, was implied in the way the silver light lingered in the windows, as if echoing the soft glow once produced by flame. Shadows formed patterns reminiscent of robed figures, and in the quietest moments, the wind seemed to carry the faintest echo of chants, an auditory memory intertwined with the perception of the observer. There was no direct manifestation, no spectral presence in the conventional sense, yet the sense of continuity was undeniable. The monastery's life persisted in memory, in structure, and in the subtle resonance of the environment. The valley's slope, gently rising around the ruins, collected and reflected the moonlight in varying shades, creating pools of silver interspersed with shadow. Frost caught on fallen stones and broken tiles, adding another layer of texture to the monochromatic tableau. Birds, long silent in the still night, occasionally stirred, their motion careful and unobtrusive, like punctuation in a slow, unfolding story. Even in these seemingly minor details, the monastery's ongoing narrative was present, a record not of events alone, but of the cumulative perception of time, memory, and environment. The historian, recalling her own experiences, understood that this nocturnal presence was less about apparition than about persistence. The ruins, the valley, the wind and the frost carried the weight of all who had inhabited the space, monks who prayed, copied manuscripts, and tended to the rhythms of daily monastic life. Scholars who documented, measured and speculated, soldiers, refugees and villagers who had sought shelter or stumbled upon the valley, and even herself, a witness to the subtle and quiet manifestations of centuries past. Each layer of presence contributed to the ongoing resonance, a tapestry woven from human attention, natural processes, and time itself. In the stillness, Hartley might have reflected that this phenomenon is not unique to the monastery. Every site of human endeavor, every structure, every space where people have left their mark, carries traces of those who occupied it. Yet the monastery is exceptional in its clarity, in the intensity with which the past manifests subtly, in the way absence itself becomes a form of presence. Here the echoes of human life are not loud or disruptive, they are patient, gentle and enduring, folded seamlessly into the rhythms of stone, ivy, wind and moonlight. The moon, tracing a slow arc across the sky, gradually revealed more of the valley. The ruins appeared simultaneously fragile and eternal, and Hartley's reflections emphasized the coexistence of permanence and impermanence. Stone and ivy would remain, wind, frost and rain would continue to alter the structures incrementally, memory and legend would persist alongside empirical observation. Nothing that had been deeply prayed over, nothing that had been recorded with devotion or witnessed with attention, ever entirely disappears. Each act of care, each ritual, each human presence leaves an imprint, however subtle, upon the environment, an imprint that may resurface in perception, in legend, or in quiet observation, long after the individuals themselves have passed. As the hours moved toward pre-dawn, the valley seemed to settle into a final meditation, a quiet acceptance of the passage of time. The monastery's arches, corridors and walls absorbed the silvery moonlight, reflecting it softly into shadowed corners. The wind whispered through ivy and broken masonry, and even the distant hills seemed to exhale with the rhythm of centuries. In this moment, it was clear that the monastery's life was not defined by active human presence, but by the ongoing interplay of stone, memory, environment, and perception. The final meditation, then, is one of impermanence framed by persistence. The monastery remains, though its occupants have long since vanished. Its stories, imprints, and subtle echoes endure in the environment and in the attentive minds of those who engage with it. Moonlight washes over the ruins, frost glistens on stones, ivy clings to walls, and the valley hums with the quiet rhythm of earth, wind, and time. In this space, Hartley and every other observer may sense that while human life is transient, the acts of devotion, observation, and care leave traces that are never entirely erased. Thus the monastery in moonlight exists as both a conclusion and a continuation. The physical ruins endure, the natural environment adapts and reclaims, and memory, perception, and legend intertwine in subtle and enduring ways. Nothing that has been deeply prayed over, documented, or attended to by human consciousness ever truly disappears. The echoes remain, delicate and persistent, embedded in stone, moss, wind, and light. And the valley, in its patient silence, carries forward the quiet resonance of centuries, inviting all who enter to witness, reflect, and attune themselves to the persistent rhythm of history, memory, and the subtle life that continues in absence.